Chapter 1. The Vanishing Glass. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were a pair of exceptionally normal, ordinary people. Mr. Dursley was the director of a manufacturing company, and Mrs. Dursley was a housewife who maintained the home and took care of the couple's young son, Dudley. They lived in an ordinary two-story home, with an ordinary green and well-trimmed lawn, with Mr. Dursley's ordinary, reasonably expensive car resting in the driveway, waiting for him to drive it to work. The Dursleys were so ordinary, so completely normal, that the very notion of any abnormalcy in their lives would be completely absurd. After all, how could such regular people have anything to hide? No one would ever suspect them of keeping even a single strange, unordinary secret, let alone that they might be keeping two. Tucked up together, in the small cupboard under the stairs, two young children were fast asleep. This was not an unusual place for them to be sleeping, as it was the only bedroom they had ever known. Laying end to end, with their bare feet in each other's faces, Harry and Violet Potter were enjoying their last, fleeting moments of rest, which was interrupted by a sharp, sudden rapping on their cupboard door. "Up! Get up! Now!" Harry was the first to sit up. He pushed his sister's feet away from his cheek and pulled the knotted light cord that dangled overhead. Violet, who slept closest to the cupboard wall, pushed herself onto her elbows and groaned. She tried to shake off the lingering thoughts of the dream she'd been having about a flying motorcycle and a very large, very hairy crying man. The dreams she had weren't usually so vivid or so strange. She would have liked to tell her brother about it if there had been time to sit and talk. Unfortunately, there was not. Aunt Petunia was back outside the door. "Are you up yet?" she demanded, her shrill voice cutting through the repeated knocking on the door. "Nearly," Harry said, and Violet tried to say through her yawn, "Well, get a move on. I want one of you to make coffee and the other to look after the bacon. And don't you dare let it burn. I want everything perfect for Dudley's special day. Dudley's birthday, of course." The Dursleys had been planning it for weeks, sneaking presents into the house after Dudley had gone to bed, and having the twins stay up late to get all the wrapping done. That way, they got a good look at all the toys and gadgets that they would never have and would never even be allowed to play with. No parties had ever been thrown to celebrate Harry and Violet being born. None that they could remember, anyway, whereas every year of their cousin Dudley's life was started with more and more enthusiasm and gusto. It appeared as though his 11th birthday was going to be the most extravagant yet. When the two children finished dressing and putting their shared bed back in order, they crawled out of their cramped sleeping cupboard and went down the hall into the kitchen. The table was almost completely hidden beneath all of Dudley's presents. Violet didn't have to guess what any of them were. She had spent the night wrapping the new computer, the second television, and the new racing bike. Neither of the twins were sure what Dudley wanted a racing bike for in the first place. He was a very fat boy who hated exercise of all kinds, with the exception of punching things. Things, of course, meaning the twins. Dudley's favorite pastime was punching Harry, though he couldn't often catch him. Harry didn't look it, but he was very fast. Violet was just as scrawny as her brother and could run just as fast, but she presented a less appealing target, as she was known to start crying when hit, which often drew unwanted attention. Perhaps it had something to do with living in a dark cupboard and eating only whatever scraps were left for them, but the twins had always been small and skinny for their age. Harry looked even smaller and skinnier than he really was, because all he had to wear were old clothes of Dudley's, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than he was. His shirts swallowed him in draped fabric, and his jeans were so large about the waist that he had to belt them. Violet got most of her clothes from Aunt Petunia when they became stained or torn, but she also had a few items that had been bought just for her when nothing else fit. Aunt Petunia's legs were too long for her shirts and trousers to fit on Violet without significant hemming, and Aunt Petunia simply didn't have the time or the inclination to take them all in. The twins made for a rather mismatched pair, whenever they were allowed to join the family on outings. A pair of thin, dark figures lagging behind and keeping out of the way, sticking close to one another and silently doing what they're told. Vernon and Petunia and Dudley, Dursley all fit in together, and Dudley was the perfect mash-up of his parents so as to leave no doubt that, yes, this child belonged with them. His meaty frame and small, dark eyes were the very picture of his father, and his straw-blonde hair and weak chin endeared him to his mother. Violet and her brother couldn't have stood out more if they tried. The twins had thin faces, thin bodies, and skinny arms and legs. Their knees and elbows were knobbly, and teachers regularly tutted at them when it was time for a weigh-in. Their black hair didn't fit in with the family, either. Harry's was cut short, but stuck up at odd angles, no matter how hard anyone tried to flatten it down. Violet's hair hung just above her shoulders, and had the unfortunate tendency of tangling up into a rat's nest whenever it wasn't tied back, and so it was kept in a short, thick braid down the back of her head. Every other night after baths, Aunt Petunia would sit her down on a hard wooden stool and brush the whole mess out. The brush would yank and pull and scratch at her scalp until Violet was nearly in tears, but her aunt wouldn't stop until her hair was straight and shiny. Then, before it could knot itself back up again, she would weave it into a very tight braid and tie it with a rubber band and warn Violet not to touch it. Violet, invariably, would disobey the next day, and the whole process had to be started over again. Despite their lack of resemblance to the rest of their family, there could be no doubt whatsoever that the twins were, in fact, twins. Their features were strikingly similar to one another, and they shared the same pair of bright green eyes. As toddlers, they were nearly impossible to differentiate nearly. Violet didn't need glasses the way her brother did, but when they were younger, it was easily for Harry to hand over his frames while the pair were changing clothes, and she could pass as him for whole days at a time. The scar on Harry's forehead was the one glaring, unavoidable feature that set him apart from his sister. It was the one thing that they could never swap, never letting them get away with disguising as each other. A thin, jagged line in the shape of a lightning bolt that Harry had and Violet did not. It had been there for as long as they could remember, though neither had any memory of the incident that caused it. In the car crash when your parents died, Aunt Petunia said once, on the single occasion that Harry had tried to bring it up. And don't ask questions. Don't ask questions, that was the first rule for a quiet life with Dursleys. There were other rules, of course. Don't talk out of turn, which really meant don't talk, ever. Keep out of the way, keep out of sight, more like. Which was exactly what Violet was trying to do at the stove, manning the bacon when Uncle Vernon came into the kitchen and sat down to read his morning paper. "Comb your hair," he barked at Harry by way of greeting. Violet waited, but no acknowledgement of her presence was made. She relaxed. Dudley waddled into the room a few minutes later, just as the food was being plated. The twins struggled to fit the food onto the table with all the presents, which Dudley was eagerly counting out. 34, 35, 36, 30, 36. He looked up at his mother and father. "That's two less than last year. Darling, you haven't counted Auntie Marge's presents, see? It's under this big one from Mummy and Daddy." "Okay, 37, said Dudley, going red in the face. Dudley often went red before he threw a tantrum and began screaming, hitting, and kicking whatever was in reach. The twins began wolfing down their eggs and toast as fast as possible, just in case Dudley turned the table over again. Aunt Petunia obviously sensed danger too, because she said quickly, "And we'll buy you presents while we're out today." "How's that, Popkin? 2 more presents. Is that all right?" Dudley thought for a moment. It looked like hard work. Finally he said slowly, "So I'll have 30. 39 sweetums," said Aunt Petunia. "Oh." Dudley sat down heavily and grabbed the nearest parcel. "All right then." Harry and Violet finished off their plates as Dudley tore into the neat wrapping paper that they'd spent all night on, barely pausing to even look at each gift before reaching for the next one. In the time it took Aunt Petunia to go and answer the phone, Dudley had already opened his racing bike, a new video camera, a remote control airplane, 16 new video games, and a DVD player. He was shredding the paper off a new gold wristwatch when Aunt Petunia returned, looking both angry and worried. "Bad news, Vernon," she said. "Mrs. Figg's broken her leg. She can't take them." She jerked her head in the direction of the twins. Dudley's mouth fell open in horror, but Violet and Harry shared a look of pure glee. Mrs. Figg was the mad old lady that their aunt and uncle dumped them on every time they made an outing. Her house smelled of cabbage and cat litter, and she didn't even own a TV. The twins hated the place and weren't all that fond of Mrs. Figg herself. Getting to tag along with the Dursleys would be a rare and wonderful treat. "They'll have to take us, won't they?" Violet murmured to her brother while the Dursleys argued over what to do with them. "They won't leave us here. Not alone, but they might call Aunt Marge over." They both shrank at the mere thought of being under the care of their Aunt Marge. Anything would be better than that. "I suppose we could leave them in the car," said Aunt Petunia, giving the pair of them a sidelong look. Harry and Violet immediately stopped talking. Dudley began to cry. The loud wailing coming from his mouth wasn't real crying at all, but Dudley knew that if he screwed up his face and hollered loud enough, he could get whatever he wanted from his mother. And what he wanted now, as he bleated between false sobs, was for Harry and Violet to be as far away from his birthday activities as possible. Aunt Petunia practically fell on top of her son to comfort him, and only the twins could see the nasty grin their cousin shot them through her arms. They were spared any more theatrics by the ringing of the doorbell and the arrival of Dudley's friend from school, Piers. He was a scrawny boy with a face like a rat, and he was usually the one holding people's arms behind their backs while Dudley hit them. Dudley stopped pretending to cry at once. Half an hour later, Violet and Harry, who couldn't believe their luck, were crammed into the back of the Dursleys' car with Piers and Dudley, on the way to the zoo for the first time in their lives. Their aunt and uncle hadn't been able to think of anything else to do with them, but before they left, Uncle Vernon had taken the pair of them aside. "I'm warning you," he said, and Violet shrank away as he put his purple face right up close to each of theirs in turn. "I'm warning you both now, any funny business, any at all, and you'll be in that cupboard from now until Christmas." "We're not going to do anything," Harry said, and Violet was grateful to feel her brother grasping for her hand. There was little else he could do with Uncle Vernon bearing down on them like this, but the small comfort was enough. But Uncle Vernon only gave them another nasty glare and a warning shake of his fat, clenched fist. He clearly didn't believe them. No one ever did. Strange things seemed to happen around the Potter twins, and ever since they were little, no matter how hard they tried, they'd never been able to convince the Dursleys that they didn't make them happen. Once, Aunt Petunia, tired of Harry coming back from the barber's looking as though he hadn't been at all, had taken a pair of kitchen scissors and cut his hair so short he was almost bald except for his bangs, which she left to hide that horrible scar. Dudley had laughed himself silly at Harry, and even in her sympathy for him, Violet couldn't suppress a giggle. That night, however, Harry broke down with worry about the next day at school and what the other children would say and do to him. Violet apologized over and over for laughing and hugged her brother until he eventually passed into an uneasy sleep. Imagine their surprise in the morning when they woke up to find Harry's hair exactly as it had been before Aunt Petunia sheared it off. He'd been given a week in the cupboard for that, even though he tried to explain that he couldn't explain how it had grown back so quickly. Violet was allowed out to do chores and cook meals, and only got to see and speak to her brother when they were told to sleep. Another time, Aunt Petunia had been trying to force Violet into a revolting old sweater, brown with orange puff balls. The harder she tried to pull it over her head, the smaller it seemed to become, until finally it might have fit a hand puppet, but certainly wouldn't fit Violet. Aunt Petunia had decided it must have shrunk in the wash, and to her great relief, Violet wasn't punished. Violet generally had an easier time avoiding reprimand, from Aunt Petunia at least, and it was a fact both twins were well aware of. Sometimes it was a sore spot between them, but just as often it had been used to their advantage. If she stood up and took the blame for something they were both in trouble for, then there was a chance Aunt Petunia would let the matter go with little more than a scowl. This tactic had never worked on Uncle Vernon. Both twins would scatter at the sound of their uncle's booming voice, trying to put themselves as far out of arm's reach as possible. It was when Harry would make a wall out of himself, between Uncle Vernon and his sister, that made them even. On the other hand, however, there were plenty of times that they couldn't get out of being punished, no matter what they did, and both of them would face the exact same wrath. They'd once gotten into terrible trouble for being caught on the roof of the school kitchens. No one could explain it, least of all the twins themselves. One minute they were running from Dudley and his gang, and the next they were on the chimney, still holding hands and looking down in befuddlement at the ground below. The Dursleys had received a very angry letter from the school's headmistress, telling them the twins had been climbing school buildings, but all they'd tried to do as they shouted at Uncle Vernon from behind the locked door of their cupboard was jump behind the big trash cans outside the kitchen doors. They supposed the wind must have caught them mid-jump. It was the only rationale they could come up with between them. But today, nothing was going to go wrong. It was even worth being stuck with Dudley and Piers to be anywhere besides school, the cupboard, or Mrs. Fig's cabbage-smelling living room. While he drove, Uncle Vernon complained to Aunt Petunia. He liked to complain about things. People at work, Harry, the council, Violet, the bank, and Harry were just a few of his favorite subjects. This morning, it was motorcycles. Roaring along like maniacs, the young hoodlums, he said, as a motorcycle overtook them. I had a dream about a motorcycle, said Harry, and Violet's gaze snapped away from the window to stare at him. Was it flying? She asked. Yes, Harry replied, looking just as startled as she felt. They both lurched against their seatbelts as Uncle Vernon slammed on the brakes, nearly hitting the car in front. He turned around in his seat and yelled at them, his face like a giant beet with a mustache. Motorcycles don't fly, Dudley and Piers sniggered. I know they don't, Harry said bravely. It was only a dream. Uncle Vernon gave one last growl before turning back around and putting his foot back on the gas. Violet watched Harry out of the corner of her eye, noting the stubborn set of his jaw and the crinkle at his brow. He shouldn't have spoken up, but she was glad he did. Carefully, so that Piers and Dudley couldn't see, she grabbed her brother's hand and squeezed once. I had the same dream, Violet murmured, and Harry turned to look at her. She squeezed his hand again, and this time he squeezed back. It's going to be okay. They didn't speak for the rest of the drive. It was a very sunny Saturday, and the zoo was crowded with families. The Dursleys bought Dudley and Piers large chocolate ice creams at the entrance, and then, because the smiling lady in the van had asked the twins what they wanted before they could be hurried away, they were each given an ice pop. They were sour, but they weren't bad. The twins had the best morning they'd had in a long time. They were careful to walk a little ways apart from the Dursleys so that Dudley and Piers, who were starting to get a little bored with the animals by lunchtime, wouldn't fall back on their favorite hobby of hitting them. They ate in the zoo restaurant, and when Dudley had a tantrum because his Knickerbocker glory didn't have enough ice cream on top, Uncle Vernon bought him another one, and the Harry and Violet were allowed to finish the first. The twins felt afterward that they should have known it all too good to last. The reptile house was their first stop after lunch. It was a long, low building, cool and dark on the inside, with little lit windows all along the walls. Behind the glass, all manner of lizards and snakes were crawling and slithering over bits of stone and wood. Violet found them all fascinating, but couldn't stay and look at each exhibit as long as she would have liked. Dudley and Piers only wanted to see huge, poisonous cobras and thick, man-crushing pythons. Dudley quickest found the largest snake in the whole exhibit. It was a beautiful brown serpent, so long it could have wrapped its body twice around Uncle Vernon's car and crushed it into a trash can, or so Piers seemed to think. But he didn't know much about anything, let alone snakes. At the moment, however, the snake didn't much look like it was up for crushing anything, let alone a whole car. In fact, it was fast asleep. "Make it move," Dudley whined to his father, pressing his nose against the glass of the enclosure. Uncle Vernon rapped the glass smartly with his knuckles, but the snake didn't budge. "Do it again," Dudley ordered. Again, Uncle Vernon rapped the glass smartly with his knuckles, but the snake just snoozed on. "This is boring," Dudley moaned. He shuffled away, Piers and his parents in tow. With the others moving on, the twins took their turn moving in front of the glass, looking in at the sleeping snake. "I wouldn't be surprised if it had died of boredom," muttered Violet, leaning down to read the information plaque in front of the display. "It's all alone in there. No company, except for stupid people drumming their fingers on the glass trying to disturb you all day long." "Sounds a bit like home to me," Harry said wryly. Suddenly, the snake opened its beady eyes. Slowly, very slowly, it raised its head until its eyes were level with Harry's through the glass. It winked. Violet's mouth fell open in shock. She looked between her brother and the snake, both of them staring into each other's eyes. To her surprise, Harry winked back. The snake jerked its head toward Uncle Vernon and Dudley, then raised its eyes to the ceiling. It was a look that said plainly, "I get that all the time." Harry made a noise from between his teeth, almost a soft whistle, though Violet had never heard him make such a noise before. Behind the glass, the snake bobbed its head vigorously, as though it were nodding. "What's happening?" Violet whispered, mostly to herself. Harry was making the whistling noise again and not paying attention to her, and the snake seemed to be gesturing with its tail to the sign next to the glass. "Boa constrictor, Brazil. Bred in captivity." When Harry put his hand to the glass and made the hissing sound again, Violet felt the little hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "You're talking to it, aren't you?" she asked her brother, taking a step closer and placing her hand on the cool glass as well. "Is it talking back? Can you hear it?" Harry looked at her then, startled, as if he'd only just realized what he was doing. He dropped his hand from the glass and stepped away, mouth working like a fish, but no words coming out to explain what was going on. When he finally started to speak, he was drowned out by a deafening shout from behind them. "Dudley, Mr. Dursley, come and look at this snake. You won't believe you hat it's doing." The next thing she knew, Violet was shoved aside as Dudley came waddling over as fast as he could. Caught by surprise, she fell hard onto the rough concrete floor, skinning her hands as she caught herself. She yelped in pain, glaring hatefully up at Dudley. What came next happened so fast no one saw how it happened. Not even Harry or Violet herself 1 second. Piers and Dudley were leaning right up close to the glass, and the next there was a great splash as Dudley went tumbling forward into the enclosure and landed right into the water pool. Piers leapt back with a yowl of horror. Violet sat up and gasped. The glass in front of the boa constrictor's tank had vanished. The great snake was uncoiling itself rapidly, slithering out onto the floor. People throughout the reptile house screamed and started running for the exits. Violet was still in shock when Harry hauled her to her feet, standing there and staring stupidly as Dudley flailed and cried in the shallow water. Over it all, she nearly missed the same strange, low whistling noise that she'd heard minutes before, only this time it wasn't coming from her brother. The keeper of the reptile house was in shock. "But the glass," he kept saying. "Where did the glass go?" Violet had no answer for this, and neither did anybody else. The zookeeper made Aunt Petunia a cup of strong, sweet tea while he apologized over and over again. Piers and Dudley could only gibber. Their tails become wilder and wilder, starting with the snake merely staring at them and ending with it, lunging, toward them through the glass and trying to drag Dudley to the bottom of the pool and drown him. By the time they reached the car, Dudley was telling them about how it had nearly bitten his leg off. But worst of all, for the twins at least, was Piers calming down enough to say, "Harry and Violet were talking to it, weren't you?" Uncle Vernon at least had the sense to wait until Piers was safely out of the house before starting in on them. He was so angry he could hardly speak. He dragged the pair of them to their cupboard, kicking and screaming, a fistful of their hair in each hand, and shoved them inside before slamming the door. Much later, Violet lay in the dark cupboard beside her brother and wished that one of them had a watch. They didn't know what time it was, and they had no way of telling if the Dursleys had gone to sleep yet. Until they had, neither of them could risk sneaking out of the kitchen for some food. The twins had lived with the Dursleys for almost 10 years. 10 miserable years, as long as they could remember, ever since they'd been babies, and their parents died in that car crash. They couldn't remember being in the car when their parents had died. Sometimes, when they were left alone in the cupboard for long stretches together, they would strain their memories and both come up with the same vision. A blinding flash of green light, and at least for Harry, a burning pain in his forehead. This, they supposed, was the crash, though neither of them could imagine where all the green light came from, and they couldn't remember their parents at all, no matter how many times they talked it over together. Their aunt and uncle never spoke about them, and of course they were forbidden to ask questions. There were not photographs of them in the house, just as there were no photographs of the twins themselves. When they had been younger, Harry and Violet had fantasized and made up futures of some unknown relative coming to take them away, but it had never happened. The Dursleys were their only family. Yet sometimes they thought, or maybe hoped, that strangers in the street seemed to know them. Very strange strangers they were, too. A tiny man in a purple top hat had bowed to them once while out shopping with Aunt Petunia and Dudley. After asking them furiously if they knew the man, Aunt Petunia had rushed them all out of the shop without buying anything. A wild-looking woman dressed in all green had waved merrily at them once on a bus. A bald man in a very long purple coat had actually come up and shaken Violet and Harry's hands in the street the other day, and then walked away without a word. The weirdest thing about these people, as the twins discussed between themselves later on, was that they seemed to vanish the second either of them tried to get a closer look. At school, the twins had no one. Everybody knew that Dudley's gang hated those odd Potter kids with their ill-fitting clothes and unkempt hair, and nobody liked to disagree with Dudley's gang. They had no one, apart from each other. "I think I did something to the glass," Violet whispered, as quietly as she possibly could. They had been silent for hours, not even daring to speak for fear of Uncle Vernon waiting outside to leap in and punish them for it. Harry lifted his head to look at her. His skinny legs were stretched across her skinny lap, while Violet sat with her back to the wall. There wasn't much room in the cupboard under the stairs. Barely enough for one person, let alone two. "I think it was talking to the snake," replied Harry just as softly. They let another long stretch of silence go between them, allowing the gravity of their words to sink in. The things they were talking about weren't possible, yet they must have happened, or else it was all some strange and terrible coincidence that had nothing to do with them at all. Not that it mattered now. The Dursleys were so angry with them that they wouldn't listen to a single word the twins had to say. And Uncle Vernon's threats from that morning, about being locked in the cupboard until Christmas, were ringing with devastating truth in Violet's mind. "They'll let us out for school at least, won't they?" Violet chewed on her lip and waited for some sort of reassurance from her brother, but when none came, she looked over in his direction. Harry's eyes were closed behind his glasses, and his mouth was hanging slightly open, and that meant that he had fallen asleep. She sighed and reached out to gently pluck the glasses from his nose and set them aside. Harry jostled slightly when she pushed his legs out of her lap, but did not wake, for which Violet was grateful. Ignoring the pangs in her empty belly and pushing aside the distressing thoughts of the day as best she could, Violet joined her twin in laying down and slipping into a fitful, uneasy sleep. Chapter 2. The Letters from No One. The escape of the Brazilian boa constrictor led to the twins' longest ever punishment. By the time they were allowed out of their cupboard for anything besides going to school, the summer holidays were just starting. It was the heat that caused Aunt Petunia to finally relent and release them, if only so that they could spend the day weeding the garden under the hot sun. The tree in the next-door neighbor's backyard offered some shade, and they even had an excuse to use the garden hose. Spraying the cold water at one another was the most fun they'd had in weeks. It was the enlifen they'd had in weeks. Although both Violet and Harry were glad that school was over, there was little escape to be had from the likes of Dudley's gang, who seemed to have taken up residence at the Dursleys' house most days. They showed up early in the mornings and didn't leave until the evening news came on, and spent all day doing nothing but laughing at Dudley's stupid jokes and trying to catch the twins. Parter hunting was a popular sport among the gang. Violet and her brother spent as much time away from the house as possible whenever the boys were around. They wandered the neighborhood and haunted the small local park. None of the other children paid them any mind, at best, and outright avoided them at worst. It meant that the two of them had just a little bit of time to themselves, time enough to think about the end of the holidays and the bright ray of hope that was school without Dudley. When September came, they would be going off to secondary school, and for the first time in their lives, their cousin wouldn't be with them. Dudley had been accepted into Uncle Vernon's old private school, Smeltings. Harry and Violet, on the other hand, were going to Stonewall High, the local public school. "Do you think people will still know about us there?" Harry asked her one afternoon, while the pair of them sat idle on the abandoned swings. "No, what about us? You know, everything that Dudley calls us. Freaks, weirdos, parters. We're it weirdos," Violet said adamantly, kicking at the dry dirt under her feet. "And I don't care what Dudley calls us. He won't be there anymore. Maybe we'll get hit less. At school, anyways. Maybe the names will go away, too. Do you want to try making friends again when school starts? Maybe people will actually talk to us for a change." Violet gripped the chains of her swing tighter, leaning back to start building up a good momentum. The little bit of wind felt good. It made her want to untie her hair and feel it rushing past her face and ears as she swung higher and higher. If she didn't know, Aunt Petunia would be furious with her for it. "I don't care about friends," she said. Her words rushed past Harry along with her as he remained stationary on his swing. "I've got you, don't I?" The following day, Aunt Petunia took Dudley to London to buy his Smeltings uniform, and an astonished Violet was told she would be coming along as well. She found herself alone in the back seat of the car, worried and excited and guilty all at once. Harry had been left at Mrs. Figg's for the day. He would smell like cats and cabbage when she got home, and knew that he wouldn't be happy about it. Aunt Petunia held Violet's hand in a vice-like grip as they walked from shop to shop, as though afraid she would slip into the shadows and disappear if let out of sight for even a moment. The first stop was for Dudley's uniform. Smeltings was an all-boys school, and the shop itself was full of only young boys and their mothers. Piers Palkis was his mum, which meant that Dudley had some entertainment besides pinching Violet's arms when Aunt Petunia wasn't watching. Smelting's boys wore maroon tailcoats, orange knickerbockers, and flat straw hats called boaters. Piers and the other boys, who'd been fitted all preened and paraded for their cooing mothers, but it was clear that each of them was only excited about a single aspect of their new school attire: the stick. Violet couldn't think of any reason why students should have to carry sticks around the school other than hitting one another with them, which was what some of the boys had already begun to do when their mums weren't looking. Dudley was practically salivating as they waited in line. It took ages for him to get fitted, however. The poor shopkeeper kept having to run to the back of the shop in search of larger and larger jackets that would fit over Dudley's immense frame. By the time they left, Violet's hand was nearly numb. The next stop, to Violet's complete surprise, was another clothing store to buy a uniform for her. The Stonewall uniform was entirely grey, and not nearly as expensive as Dudley's uniform had been. Aunt Petunia went to the trouble of picking a few sizes off the rack for Violet to try on before buying the set, brand new and all. Violet had never owned any brand new clothing before. "What about Harry?" she asked Aunt Petunia as they were heading to the clerk's counter. Her aunt's lips tightened the way they always did when one of them dared to ask a question. "What about him? Isn't he getting a uniform too?" Don't be stupid, snapped Aunt Petunia. I've got some of Dudley's old things at home to dye for him. They'll look just like everybody else's. Violet very much doubted that, but thought it best not to argue. She tried not to think about how Harry would react to that and to their first day at school. Her in her new and normal uniform, and him in his overlarge hand-me-downs. She held on to her shopping bag of clothes all the way home, wondering if he would be angry with her. It's not like a sked for special treatment, and she certainly didn't expect it. Dudley picked on her just as much as he did Harry, and Uncle Vernon had no problem at all with grabbing or hurting her. It was just Aunt Petunia who, sometimes, in the smallest of ways, seemed to show her a bit of kindness. Whatever the reason for it, and however it might have made her brother feel, Violet was grateful for it. She would take any little comfort from her family that she could get. That night, when she explained what had happened, Violet was surprised at how unaffected Harry seemed at the news, almost as though he expected it. He wasn't angry with her, and he wasn't as upset about his uniform as she'd feared. He only seemed resigned. There was a horrible smell in the kitchen the next morning, which turned out to be coming from a large metal tub in the sink, filled with dirty rags and grey water. This, the twins realized, was to be Harry's school uniform. Violet felt the guilt sitting in her belly like a stone. Dudley and Uncle Vernon came in, both with wrinkled noses from the smell. Uncle Vernon opened his newspaper as usual, and Dudley banged his new smelting stick, which he carried everywhere, on the table. They heard the click of the mail slot and flop of letters on the doormat. "Get the mail, Dudley," said Uncle Vernon from behind his paper. "Make Harry get it." "Get the mail, Harry. Make Violet get it. Poke him with your smelting stick, Dudley." Harry dodged the smelting stick, ignored Violet's glare, and went to get the mail while Violet continued nibbling on her toast. "Hurry up, boy," shouted Uncle Vernon, when Harry hadn't returned for several moments. "What are you doing, checking for letter bombs?" Violet watched as her brother shuffled back into the kitchen, staring at the stack of mail in his hands. He handed most of it to Uncle Vernon, and then, wordlessly, passed a letter to Violet. She put her toast down and stared at it. Miss V part of the cupboard under the stairs 4 Privet Drive Little Winging Surrey Violet swallowed hard. In her entire life, she had never once received a letter addressed directly to her, let alone one referring to the place in which she slept. Was that common in addressing letters? It seemed awfully forward. The envelope itself was like no other letter she'd ever seen either. It was thick and heavy, made of yellowish parchment, and the address was written in emerald green ink. There was no stamp. On the back of it, she noticed, carefully turning the thing over in her hands, perhaps she should check it for letter bombs, was a purple wax seal bearing a coat of arms, a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a snake surrounding a large letter. She ran her thumb over the hard, embossed symbol. "Dad," said Dudley suddenly. "Dad, Harry's got something." Harry, who had already torn his envelope open and was at the point of unfolding the letter within, looked up sharply as the letter was jerked out of his hands by Uncle Vernon. "That's mine," he said, trying to snatch it back. Immediately, and while no one was looking at her, Violet lifted the hem of her shirt and stuck her letter beneath it. It was just in time as well. Uncle Vernon had just shaken open Harry's letter with one hand and glanced at it, and his face went from red to green faster than a set of traffic lights. Then, most alarmingly of all, it went the grayish-white of old porridge. "P.P. Petunia," he gasped. Dudley made a grab for Harry's letter, but Uncle Vernon held it high out of reach. Aunt Petunia took it curiously and read the first line. For a moment it looked as though she might faint. She clutched her throat and made a choking sound. "Vernon." "Oh my goodness, Vernon." They stared at each other, seeming to forget about the 3 children in the room. Dudley, who was not at all used to being ignored, gave his father a sharp tap on the head with his smelting stick. "I want to read that letter," he said loudly. "I want to read it," Harry said, even louder, "as it's mine." "Get out, all of you," croaked Uncle Vernon, stuffing the letter back into its envelope. Violet practically leapt off her chair and made a beeline for the hall. She almost made it too before Uncle Vernon's fat, meaty hand closed around her upper arm. "Not you, girl, hand it over. I know you've got it." Violet shook her head frantically. "I don't have anything, I swear." "Don't you lie to me," he snarled, yanking her closer to him. "Give it here." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as her uncle began grabbing and pinching at her, trying to find the letter she'd tucked away. His hand found its way under the front of her shirt and found the concealed parchment against her stomach. Violet wrenched herself out of his grasp, but the letter was already in his other hand. "No, get out," Uncle Vernon said again, and again Violet went scurrying for the door. Harry, however, did not move. "I want my letter," Harry shouted. "Let me see it," demanded Dudley. "Out!" roared Uncle Vernon, and Violet had barely managed to get out of the way before her brother was thrown into the hall after her. A moment later, and Dudley was pushed out with them. She watched the boys engage in a furious but silent fight over who would listen at the keyhole. Dudley won, so Harry dropped flat on his stomach to listen at the crack between the door and the floor. Violet didn't care enough to try and listen to what her aunt and uncle were saying. Her arm hurt and would surely bruise, and her shirt suddenly felt as though it didn't cover her properly. "I told you you were freaks," Dudley hissed, in response to something he must have heard his mother and father say. He stepped on Harry's hand before walking away and gave Violet an unnecessary shove for good measure. Quietly, she went and helped her brother up off the floor. "Did you hear anything?" she asked. Harry was rubbing the dirt from his knuckles where Dudley's shoe had squashed them. "Uncle Vernon thinks we're being spied on," he answered, frowning, "and that they don't want us in the house. Thaver never wanted us in the house, but who would want to spy on us? We're not. We're nobody, aren't we?" Harry merely shrugged. That evening, when he got back from work, Uncle Vernon did something that he'd never done before in the daytime. He visited Harry and Violet in their cupboard. "Where's our letters?" said Harry, the moment Uncle Vernon had squeezed through the door. Unfortunately, it was just large enough for him to do so. "Who's writing to us?" "No one. It was addressed to you by mistake," said Uncle Vernon shortly. "I have burned it." "It was not a mistake," said Violet angrily. "It had our cupboard on it." "Silence!" yelled Uncle Vernon, and she immediately shrank backward. He took a few deep breaths and then forced his face into a smile which looked quite painful. Yes, Violet, about this cupboard. Your aunt and I have thinking. You're really getting too big for it, the pair of you. We think it might be nice if you moved into Dudley's second bedroom." The second bedroom was upstairs and down the hall from Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia's bedroom. Violet didn't want to sleep there at all. At least sleeping under the stairs there was some warning of someone approaching, but right there, only a few short steps away. "Why?" said Harry, who must have shared her suspicions. "Don't ask questions," snapped their uncle in typical fashion. He glared at them as she shuffled backwards out of the cramped cupboard. "Take this stuff upstairs now." The Dursleys' house had 4 bedrooms, one for Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia, one for visitors, usually Uncle Vernon's sister, Aunt Marge, one where Dudley slept, and one where Dudley kept all the toys and things that wouldn't fit into his first bedroom. It only took one trip for the twins to move everything they owned from the cupboard to this room. Violet sat down on the bed Thea-libed, which she and Harry would again be sharing, and stared around herself. Nearly everything in here was broken. The month-old video camera was lying on top of a small, working tank Dudley had once driven over the next-door neighbor's dog. In the corner was Dudley's first-ever television set, which he put his foot through when his favorite program had been cancelled. There was a large birdcage, which had once held a parrot that Dudley had swapped at school for a real air rifle, which was up on a shelf with the end all bent because Dudley had sat on it. Other shelves were full of books. They were the only things in the room that looked as though they'd never been touched. Violet had never been allowed to read any books other than the ones assigned to her in school. They Dursleys didn't want them reading any fanciful stories and getting ideas in their head. But Dudley had been given loads of books over the years by well-meaning relatives and parents of friends who didn't know what else to get him that he didn't already have. While Harry stretched out on the bed and pouted, Violet stood up and walked over to the shelves and went through all the titles on the spines. She picked out 4 or 5 that looked interesting, sat down on the floor, and began to read. Next morning at breakfast, everyone was rather quiet. Dudley was in shock. He'd screamed, whacked his father with his smelting stick, been sick on purpose, kicked his mother, and thrown his tortoise through the greenhouse roof, and he still didn't have his room back. Harry was still stewing over their stolen letters, which he'd grumbled about most of the evening before. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia kept looking at each other darkly. When the mail arrived, Uncle Vernon, who seemed to be trying to be nice to the twins, made Dudley go and get it. They heard him banging things with his smelting stick all the way down the hall. Then he shouted, "There's more of them." Mr. H. Potter, the smallest bedroom, 4 Privet Drive, with a strangled cry, Uncle Vernon leapt from his seat and ran down the hall, Harry right behind them. Violet listened to them struggling and fighting from the kitchen, watching Aunt Petunia's face growing whiter and whiter. When Uncle Vernon returned, it was with his hands held high over his head and 2 crumpled envelopes clenched in his fists. "Go to your cupboard, I mean, your bedroom," he wheezed, jerking his head at Violet to say that meant her too. "Dudley, just go." Back in their new room, Harry was walking round and round with his hands balled up at his sides. "Someone knows we've moved out of the cupboard," he was saying, while Violet watched from behind her drawn-up knees on the bed. "And they probably know we didn't get our first set of letters. They Vigato know, or else why would they send more?" "Then they'll try again, won't they?" asked Violet. Harry nodded firmly, not breaking his circular stride. "They've got to. Whoever they are, they want us to have those letters. They want to have those letters. I don't know what they are or who they're from, but they were addressed to you and me, and it's not fair we don't get to read them. It feels important, doesn't it? Maybe it's like we wanted when we were little." "What do you mean?" Violet chewed on the inside of her lip for a moment. She felt foolish to even think it. Those were just childhood dreams, thought up in boredom and desperation. She wished she hadn't even brought it up, but now her brother had stopped pacing and was looking at her curiously. She took a deep breath. "About someone coming to take us away," Violet said quickly. "Or give us lots of money or something, a relative that we didn't know about. There's got to be someone besides the Dursleys, hasn't there? There's got to be." Harry was staring at her intensely, the way he sometimes did when he was plotting something rebellious. He was the brave one, out of the 2 of them. And right now, Violet could see that her words had lit a hopeful little fire inside of him. Harry gave up on his pacing entirely and sat beside her on the bed. Violet allowed her hand to be taken and held, and relaxed slightly as Harry gave it a weak squeeze. "I'm going to get those letters, Violet. I'll get them for us. I promise." The next morning, Violet was awoken by Uncle Vernon shouting. She rocketed out of bed and rushed to the top of the stairs, down which she could see the bulk of Uncle Vernon in his pajamas, standing in a sleeping bag like he was part of a sack race, while Harry cowered back against the wall. He was dressed with his shoes on. Likely, he tried to sneak out of the house and stumbled into Uncle Vernon lying in wait. The shouting went on for nearly half an hour. Harry was sent to his room, and Violet was told to make her uncle a cup of tea. By the time she had shuffled into the kitchen and back, the mail had arrived, right into Uncle Vernon's lap. She could see 5 letters addressed in green ink. "I want," she began, but Uncle Vernon was tearing the letters to pieces before her eyes. Uncle Vernon did not go to work that day. He stayed at home and nailed up the mail slot. "See," he explained to Aunt Petunia through a mouthful of nails, "if they can't deliver them, they'll just give up." "I'm not sure that'll work, Vernon." "It won't," Harry said adamantly when Violet returned upstairs and told him what she'd seen. "They'll keep coming, and Uncle Vernon can't keep them all from us forever. You'll see Romans 6. He won't stop them." By Saturday, things had begun to get out of hand. Uncle Vernon had already missed 2 days of work. He'd boarded up the entire front door, and all the cracks around it, and half of the front windows. Not that it had done any good. 24 letters to Violet, and Harry found their way into the house. rolled up inside each of the 2 dozen eggs that their very confused milkman had handed Aunt Petunia through the living room window. While Uncle Vernon made furious calls to the post office and the dairy to find someone to complain to, Aunt Petunia shredded the letters in her food processor. "Who on earth wants to talk to you this badly?" Dudley asked Violet in amazement. On Sunday morning, Uncle Vernon sat down at the breakfast table looking rather tired and rather ill, but happy. "No post on Sundays," he reminded them cheerfully as he spread marmalade on his newspapers. "No damn letters today." Something came whizzing down the kitchen chimney as he spoke and caught him sharply in the back of the head. Next moment, 30 or 40 letters came pelting out of the fireplace like bullets. The Dursleys ducked. Harry leapt into the air trying to catch one. "Out! Out!" Uncle Vernon seized Harry around the waist and threw him into the hall. Violet, who had dropped to the floor and crawled underneath the table to try and snatch one of the fallen letters, cried out as she was grabbed by the hair and dragged out into the open. "That does it," said Uncle Vernon, slamming kitchen door shut behind them. They could all hear the letters still streaming into the room, bouncing off the walls and floor. "I want you all back here in 5 minutes ready to leave. We're going away. Just pack some clothes. No arguments." He looked so furious and crazed that no one dared argue. 10 minutes later, they had wrenched their way through the boarded-up doors and were in the car, speeding toward the highway. Dudley was sniffling in the back seat. His father had, for the very first time, hit him round the head for holding them up while he tried to pack his television, VCR, and computer in his sports bag. They drove, and they drove. Even Aunt Petunia didn't dare ask where they were going. Every now and then Uncle Vernon would take a sharp turn and drive in the opposite direction for a while. "Shake 'em off, shake 'em off," he would mutter whenever he did this. They didn't stop to eat or drink all day. By nightfall, Dudley was howling. He'd never had such a bad day in his life. He was hungry. He'd missed 5 television programs he wanted to see, and he's never gone so long without blowing up an alien on his computer. Uncle Vernon stopped at last outside a gloomy-looking hotel on the outskirts of a big city. Dudley shared a room with Harry and Violet with 2 twin beds and damp, musty sheets. Dudley snored, but the twins stayed wide awake, sitting on the windowsill, conversing in hushed voices about where they might be headed and what might be waiting for them when they got there. They ate stale cornflakes and cold tinned tomatoes on toast for breakfast the next day. They had just finished when the owner of the hotel came up to their table. "'Scuse me, but which of you are the Potters?" Only I got about an hundred of these at the front desk. She held up a letter so they could read the green ink address. "Mr. H. Potter, room 17, Railview Hotel, Cokeworth." Harry made a grab for the letter, but Uncle Vernon knocked his hand out of the way. The woman stared. "I'll take them," sobbed Uncle Vernon, standing up quickly and following her from the dining room. "Wouldn't it be better just to go home, dear?" Aunt Petunia suggested timidly hours later, but Uncle Vernon didn't seem to hear her. Exactly what he was looking for, none of them knew. He drove them into the middle of a forest, got out, looked around, shook his head, got back in the car, and off they went again. The same thing happened in the middle of a plowed field, halfway across a suspension bridge, and at the top of a multi-level parking garage. "Daddy's gone mad, hasn't he?" Dudley asked Aunt Petunia dully late that afternoon. Uncle Vernon had parked at the coast, locked them all inside the car, and disappeared. It started to rain. Great drops beat on the roof of the car. Dudley sniveled. "It's Monday," he told his mother. "The great Humberto's on tonight. I want to stay somewhere with Aitlevision." Monday. This reminded Violet of something. If was Monday, and you could usually count on Dudley to know the days of the week, because television then tomorrow, Tuesday, was her and Harry's 11th birthdays. Of course, their birthdays were never exactly fun last year. The Dursleys had given Harry a pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks, and Violet had received a half-empty packet of chewing gum. Still, you weren't 11 every day. Uncle Vernon was back, and he was smiling. He was also carrying a long, thin package and didn't answer Aunt Petunia when she asked what he's bought. "Found the perfect place," he said. "Come on, everyone out." It was very cold outside the car. Uncle Vernon was pointing at what looked like a large rock way out at sea. Perched on top of the rock was the most miserable little shack you could imagine. One thing was certain, there was no television in there. "Storm forecast for tonight," said Uncle Vernon gleefully, clapping his hands together. "And this gentleman's kindly agreed to lend us his boat." A toothless old man came ambling up to them, pointing, with a rather wicked grin, at an old rowboat bobbing in the iron-grey water below them. "I've already got us some rations," said Uncle Vernon, "so all aboard." It was freezing in the boat, and there was barely enough room for all of them. Dudley huddled close to his mother and buried his face in her thin shoulder, and Violet clung to Harry as the boat rocked and tilted beneath them. Icy sea spray and rain crept down their necks, and a chilly wind whipped their faces. After what seemed like hours, they reached the rock, where Uncle Vernon, slipping and sliding, led the way to the broken-down house. The inside was horrible. It smelled strongly of seaweed, the wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden walls, and the fireplace was damp and empty. There were only 2 rooms. Uncle Vernon's rations turned out to be a bag of chips and 4 bananas. He tried to start a fire, but the empty chips bag just smoked and shriveled up. "Could do with some of those letters now, eh?" he said cheerfully. He was in a very good mood. Obviously, he thought nobody stood a chance of reaching them here in a storm to deliver mail. Violet privately agreed, though the thought didn't cheer her up at all. Harry looked as though he might cry out of frustration. As night fell, the promised storm blew up around them. Spray from the high waves splattered the walls of the hut, and a fierce wind rattled the filthy windows. Aunt Petunia found a few mouldy blankets in the second room and made up a bed for Dudley on the moth-eaten sofa. She and Uncle Vernon went off to the lumpy bed next door, and the twins were left to find the softest bit of floor they could and curl up together under the thinnest, most ragged blanket. The storm raged more and more viciously as the night went on. Violet couldn't sleep. She shivered and turned over, trying to get comfortable, her stomach rumbling with hunger. She and Harry hadn't been allowed any chips and had to share a single banana between them. Dudley's snores were drowned out by the low rolls of thunder that started near midnight. The lighted dial of Dudley's watch, which was dangling over the edge of the sofa on his fat wrist, told Violet that she and her brother would be 11 in 10 minutes' time. "It's almost time," she whispered to Harry beside her, who had been shivering violently ever since they stepped off the boat. "For WW what?" he chattered. Violet gave him a soft kick with one of her frozen feet. "Our birthday. Don't tell me you forgot, too." Harry was silent for a long moment. "How long and now?" "5 minutes to midnight. What do you want to wish for?" It was a tradition they had started, back when they were very young, to make a single shared wish together on their birthday. Back in their cupboard, they would talk and argue and decide what to wish on, and then they would curl up together, face to face and hand in hand with their eyes squeezed shut in concentration as they made their birthday wish. To date, none of them had ever come true. But they only got one wish a year. It would be a shame to waste it. 3 minutes to go. Violet twisted over onto her other side, facing Harry. She found his shaking hand with her own numb one. "I want to go home," she whispered. When Harry didn't answer her, she feared her words had been lost among the noises of the storm. But then, "Me too, Violet." Harry squeezed her hand, and they both shut their eyes and wished with all of their might. It was odd, trying to think of exactly what home was supposed to mean. The Dursleys' house was where she'd lived for all of her life, but was it really home? Was home the cupboard under the stairs? A prison as much it was a bedroom? Could home be the new bedroom upstairs, surrounded by other broken and abandoned things? Whatever home was, and wherever it could be found, that was where Violet wanted to be more than any place in the world. Not on the cold floor of a shack by the ocean. Not on a musty motel mattress on the outskirts of civilization. She wanted home. Boom. The whole shack shivered and Violet sat bolt upright, staring at the door. Someone was outside, knocking to come in. Chapter 3. The Keeper of Keys. Boom, they knocked again. Dudley jerked awake. "Where's the cannon?" he said stupidly. There was a crash behind them, and Uncle Vernon came skidding into the room. He was holding a rifle in his hands. Now they knew what had been in a long, thin package he had brought with them. "Who's there?" he shouted. "I warn you I'm armed." There was a pause, then smash. The door was hit with such force that it swung clean off its hinges and with a deafening crash landed flat on the floor. A giant of a man was standing in the doorway. His face was almost completely hidden by a long, shaggy mane of hair and a wild, tangled beard, but you could make out his eyes, glinting like black beetles under all the hair. The giant squeezed his way into the hut, stooping so that his head just brushed the ceiling. He bent down, picked up the door, and fitted it easily back into its frame. The noise of the storm outside dropped a little. He turned to look at them all. "Couldn't make us a cup of tea, could ye? It's not been an easy journey." He strode over to the sofa where Dudley sat frozen with fear. "Budge up, ye great lump," said the stranger. Dudley squeaked and ran to hide behind his mother, who was crouching, terrified, behind Uncle Vernon. "And here they are," said the giant. Violet looked up into the fierce, wild, shadowy face and saw that the beetle eyes were crinkled in a smile. "Last time I saw you, you was only a baby. You're as lovely as your mother," said the giant, nodding to Violet before turning to Harry. "And you take a great deal after your father." Uncle Vernon made a funny, rasping noise. "I demand that you leave at once, sir," he said. "You are breaking and entering." "Ah, shut up, Dursley, ye great prune," said the giant. He reached over the back of the sofa, jerked the gun out of Uncle Vernon's hands, bent it into a knot as easily as if it had been made of rubber, and threw it into a corner of the room. "Anyway, Harry, Violet," said the giant, turning his back on the Dursleys. "A very happy birthday to ye both. Got summat fur ye here. I might have sat on it at some point, but it'll taste all right." From an inside pocket of his black overcoat, he pulled a slightly squashed box. Violet remained completely frozen in shock, but Harry reached for it and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a large, sticky chocolate cake with "Happy Birthday, Harry" Violet written on it in green icing. The twins looked back up at the giant. Violet reflexively said, "Thank you." At the same moment Harry asked, "Who are you?" The giant chuckled. "True, I haven't introduced myself. Rubeus Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts." He held out an enormous hand and took turns shaking each of their entire arms. "What about that tea then, eh?" he said, rubbing his hands together. "I'd not say no ter summat stronger if ye have got it mind." His eyes fell on the empty grate with the shriveled chip bags in it, and he snorted. He bent down over the fireplace. They couldn't see what he was doing, but when he drew back a second later, there was a roaring fire there. It filled the whole damp hut with flickering light, and Violet felt the warmth wash over her as though she'd sunk into a hot bath. The giant sat back down on the sofa, which sagged under his weight, and began taking all sorts of things out of the pockets of his coat. A copper kettle, a squashy pack of sausages, a poker, a teapot, several chipped mugs, and a bottle of some amber liquid that he took a swig from before starting to make tea. Soon the hut was full of the sound and smell of sizzling sausage. Nobody said a thing while the giant was working, but as he slid the first 6 fat, juicy, slightly burnt sausages from the poker, Dudley fidgeted a lit. Uncle Vernon said sharply, "Don't touch anything he gives you, Dudley." The giant chuckled darkly. "Your great puddin' of a son darn need fattening any more, Dursley, darn worry." He passed the sausages to Harry and Violet in turn, who were so hungry they had never tasted anything so wonderful, but neither could they take their eyes off of the giant. Finally, as nobody seemed about to explain anything, Harry took the initiative and said, "I'm sorry, but I still don't really know who you are." The giant took a gulp of his tea and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Call me Hagrid," he said. "Everyone does. And like I told ye, I'm keeper of keys at Hogwarts. Ye'll know all about Hogwarts, of course." No," said Harry. Hagrid looked shocked. "Sorry," Harry said quickly. Sorry, barked Hagrid, turning to stare at the Dursleys, who shrank back into the shadows. It's them as should be sorry. I knew ye weren't gettin' your letters, but I never though ye wouldn't even know aboo Hogwarts, for crying out loud. Did ye never wonder where your parents learned it all? All what? Asked Violet. All what? Hagrid thundered. Now wait, Juice, 1 second. Violet scrambled backward as he leapt to his feet, tucking herself behind Harry as best she could. But Hagrid's attention was not focused on the twins at all. He rounded on the Dursleys, cowering against the wall, and his anger seemed to fill the whole hut. Do you meant to tell me, he growled at the Dursleys, that these kids, know nothing aboo anything? We know some things, Harry said, even as Violet yanked hard at the back of his shirt to try and shush him. We can, do math and stuff. But Hagrid simply waved his hand and said, about a world, I mean, your world, my world, your parents' world. What world? Hagrid looked as he was about to explode. Dursley, he boomed. Uncle Vernon had gone very pale, whispered something that sounded like Mimblewimble. Hagrid stared wildly at the twins. But ye must know about your mum and dad, he said. Therephilus, Eurephilus. That pricked up Violet's ears. She peeked out from behind Harry's shoulder, more confident now that the anger was not being directed at her. How could they be famous? She asked. We've never heard anything about that before. Yeah, darn no. Yeah, darn no. Hagrid ran his fingers through his hair, fixing the pair of them with a bewildered stare. Yeah, darn no what yeah, he said finally. Uncle Vernon suddenly found his voice. Stop, he commanded. Stop right there, sir. I forbid you to tell them anything. A braver man than Vernon Dursley would have quailed under the furious look Hagrid now gave him. When Hagrid spoke, his every syllable trembled with rage. You never told them what was in the letter Dumbledore left for them. I was there. I saw Dumbledore leave it, Dursley, and you've kept it from them for all these years. Kept what from us? Said Harry eagerly. Stop, I forbid you, yelled Uncle Vernon in panic. Aunt Petunia gave a gasp of horror. Ah, go boil your heads, both of ye, said Hagrid. Harry, you're a wizard. There was silence inside the hut. Only the sea and the whistling wind could be heard. I'm a what? Gasped Harry. A wizard, of course, said Hagrid. And Miss Violet, that make you a witch. And a thumpin' good un, I'd say, once ye have been trained up a bit. With a mum and dad likes yours, what else would ye be? And I reckon it's about time ye read your letters. Hagrid reached back into his coat and produced 2 yellowish envelopes, addressed in green ink, one for Harry and one for Violet. Miss V. Potter, the floor, hut on the rock, the sea. With shaking hands, the twins reached for the envelopes and finally pulled out the letters inside and began to read. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Headmaster, Albus Dumbledore, Order of Merlin, First Class, Grand Sork, CHF. Warlock, Supreme Mugwump, International Conft. Of Wizards, dear Miss Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and equipment. Term begins on September 1. We await your owl by no later than July 31. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall. Deputy Headmistress Violet stared, numbly and dumbly, at the thick piece of parchments in her hands and the words it contained. She reread it twice, and then a third time, just to be sure she understood correctly. Accepted to Ashwell for witches and wizards. Her, and Harry too. Her brother, as usual, must have managed to collect his thoughts quick enough to ask, what does it mean they await our owl? Galloping Gorgons, that reminds me, said Hagrid, clapping a hand to his forehead with enough force to knock over a cart horse, and from yet another pocket inside his overcoat he pulled an owl, a real, live, rather ruffled-looking owl, a long quill, and a roll of parchment. With his tongue between his teeth, he scribbled a note that Violet could read upside down. Dear Professor Dumbledore, given Potters their letters. Taking them to buy their things tomorrow. Weather's horrible. Hope you're well. Hagrid rolled up the note, gave it to the owl, which clamped it in its beak, went to the door, and threw the owl out into the storm. Then he came back and sat down, as though this was as normal as talking on the telephone. Violet realized her mouth was open and closed it quickly. "Where was I?" said Hagrid, but at that moment Uncle Vernon, still ashen-faced but looking very angry, moved into the firelight. "They're not going," he said. Hagrid grunted. "I'd like to see a great muggle like you stop 'em," he said. "A what?" said Harry. "A muggle," said Hagrid. "It's what we call non-magic folk like them. And it's bad like you two grew up in a family, the biggest muggles I ever laid eyes on. We swore when we took them in we'd put a stop to that rubbish," said Uncle Vernon. "Swore we'd stamp it out of them." "Yauknu," said Violet, finally finding her voice. "The whole time, and Yauk knew we were magic." "Knew," shrieked Aunt Petunia suddenly. "Knew, of course we knew. How could you not be, my sister being what she was?" "Oh, she got a letter just like that, and disappeared off to that Thatchel, and came home every vacation with her pockets full of frog spawn, turning teacups into rats. I was the only one who saw her for what she was, a freak. But for my mother and father, oh no, it was Lily this and Lily that. They were proud of having a witch in the family." She stopped to draw a deep breath and then went ranting on. It seemed she had been wanting to say all of this for years. "Then she met that Potter at school and they left and got married and had you. And of course I knew you'd be just as strange, just as abnormal. And then, if you please, she went and got herself blown up and we got landed with you lot." Violet had gone very white, staring at the malice in her aunt's narrowed eyes. "Blown up," Harry said, the first to find his words. "You told us they died in a car crash." "Car crash," roared Hagrid, jumping up so angrily that the Dursleys scuttled back to their corner. "How could a car crash kill Lily and James Potter? It's an outrage, a scandal. The Potters' children not knowing their own story when every kid our world knows their names." "But why?" Harry pressed urgently. "What happened?" The anger faded from Hagrid's face. He looked suddenly anxious. "I never expected this," he said, in a low, worried voice. "I had no idea. Dumbledore told me there might be trouble getting hold of ye. How much ye didn't know." "Ah, you too. I darn know if I'm the right person to tell ye, but someone's gotta ye can't go off to Hogwarts not knowing." He threw a dirty look at the Dursleys. "Well, it's best ye know as much as I can tell ye, mind. I can't tell ye everything. It's a great mystery, parts of it." He sat down, stared into the fire for a few seconds, and then said, "It begins, I supposed, with a person called, but it's incredible ye darn know his name. Everyone in our world knows. Who? Well, I darn like saying the name if I can help it." "No one does." "Why not?" Gulpin gargoyles Harry. "People are still scared. Blimey, this is difficult. See, there was this wizard who went bad as you could go, worse than worse. His name was—" Hagrid gulped, but no words came out. "Could you write it down?" Violet suggested softly. "Nah, can't spell it. All right, Voldemort." Hagrid shuddered. "Darn, make me say it again. Anyways, this wizard, about 20 years ago now, started looking for followers. Got 'em, too some were afraid, some just wanted a bit o' his powers, 'cause he was getting himself power, all right. Dark days those were. Didn't know who to trust, didn't dare get friendly with strange witches or wizards. Terrible things happened. He was talking over. Course, some stood up to him and he killed them, horribly. One o' the only safe places left was Hogwarts. Reckon Dumbledore's the only one you know who was afraid of. Didn't dare try talking the school, not juice then anyway. Now, your mum and dad were as good a witch and wizard as I ever knew. Head boy and girl at Hogwarts in their day. Suppose the mystery is why you know who never tried to get 'em on his side before. Probably knew they were too close to Dumbledore to want anything to do with the dark side. Maybe he could persuade 'em. Maybe he just wanted 'em out of the way. All anyone knows it, he turned up in the village where you all was living on Halloween 10 years ago. You lot was just a year old. He came to your house and Hagrid suddenly pulled out a very dirty, spotted handkerchief and blew his nose with a sound like a foghorn. "Sorry," he said. "But it's that sad knew your mum and dad, and nicer people ye couldn't find anyway. You know who killed 'em. And then, this is the real mystery of the thing, he tried to kill you, too. Wanted ter make a clean job of it, I suppose, or maybe he just liked killin' by then. But he couldn't do it. Hagrid paused and turned his attention solely on Harry. Never wondered how you got that mark on your forehead. That was no ordinary cut. That's what ye get when a powerful, evil curse touches ye. Took care of your mum and dad and your house, even, but it didn't work on you. And that's why you're famous. No one ever lived after he decided to kill 'em. No one except you, and he'd killed some the best witches and wizards of the age, the McKinnons, the Bones, the Prowets, and you was only a baby, and you lived. Violet stared at her brother, at the jagged scar now standing out livid on his pallid forehead. As Hagrid's story came to a close, something very painful began to swirl in her mind. She saw the blinding green flash of light more clearly than she had ever remembered it before, and she remembered something else for the first time in her life. A high, cold, cruel laugh. Nothing that she or Harry had ever recalled before in all their long talks about their earliest memories had ever been as crisp as that sound, ringing through her mind. Hagrid was watching them sadly. Took ye from the ruined house myself, on Dumbledore's orders. Bra ye ter this lot. Load of old tosh, said Uncle Vernon. Violet jumped. She had almost forgotten that the Dursleys were even there. Uncle Vernon certainly seemed to have got back his courage. He was glaring at Hagrid and his fists were clenched. Now you listen here, he snarked. I accept there's something strange about you, probably nothing a good beating wouldn't have curted. And as for all this about your parents, well, they were weirdos, no denying it. And the world's better off without them, in my opinion. Asked for all they got. Getting mixed up with these wizarding types, just what I expected. Always knew they'd come to a sticky end. But at that moment, Hagrid leapt from the sofa and drew a battered pink umbrella from inside his coat. Pointing this at Uncle Vernon like a sword, he said, I'm warning you, Dursley, I'm warning you one more word. In danger of being speared on the end of an umbrella by a bearded giant, Uncle Vernon's courage failed again. He flattened himself against the wall and fell silent. That's better, said Hagrid, breathing heavily and sitting back down on the sofa, which this time sagged right down to the floor. Violet quite enjoyed the sight of her uncle being the one to cower for a change. But what happened to Val? Sorry, Harry started. Violet could practically feel him buzzing with curiosity and questions beside her. I mean, what happened to you-know-who? Good question, Harry. Disappeared, vanished. Same night he tried to kill you. Makes you even more famous. That's the biggest mystery, see. He was getting more and more powerful. Why'd he go? Some say he died. Cardswallop, in my opinion. Dunno if he had enough human left in him to die. Some say he's still out there, biding his time like, but I don't believe it. People who was on his side came back ter hours. Some 'em came out a kinder trances. Darn reckon they could have done if he was comin' back. Most of us reckon he's still out there somewhere but lost his powers. Too weak to carry on, 'cause something about you finished him, Harry. There was something goin' on that night. He hadn't counted on, I dunno what it was. No one does, but something about you stumped him, all right. Hagrid was looking at Harry with warmth and respect blazing in his eyes, but Violet, sitting beside her brother, felt a terrible mix of pride and jealousy clashing in her tummy. Like oil poured onto a glass of water, the two bubbled and fought to occupy the same space inside her. Pride that her brother was someone special, and jealousy that she, apparently, was not. It must have been by bad luck that this you-know-who had targeted Harry first instead of her. But if it had been the other way around, would she be the one sitting there with a scar on her forehead? Or would she be dead, too, like their parents? It was a terrible thing to think, but it was what Harry said next that made it all the worse. Hagrid, he said quietly. I think you must have made a mistake. I don't think we can be wizards. Violet stared at her twin in disbelief, but Hagrid merely chuckled. Not wizards, eh? Never made things happen when you was scared or angry. The glass, Violet said quickly. She grabbed onto Harry's arm to make him look at her. At the zoo, and the snake. And all the time we were running so fast it felt like our feet weren't even on the ground. And Harry, your hair, don't you remember? All those things we could never explain, were never allowed to talk about. Can't you see now what it was? Harry looked between her and Hagrid, who was beaming at them. "See," said Hagrid, "your sister's got the right of it. The Potter's children, not wizards, you said. You'll both be right famous at Hogwarts." But Uncle Vernon wasn't going to give in without a fight. "Haven't I told you they're not going?" he hissed. "They're going to Stonewall High, and they will be grateful for it. I've read those letters, and they need all sorts of rubbish spellbooks and wands. And if they want to go, a great muggle like you won't stop them," growled Hagrid. "Stop Lily and James Potter's kids going to Hogwarts. You're mad. Their name's been down ever since they were born. They're off to the finest school of witchcraft and wizardry in the world. They'll be with youngsters of their own sort, for a change, and be under the greatest headmaster Hogwarts ever had, Albus Dumbledore. I am not paying for some crackpot old fool to teach them magic tricks," yelled Uncle Vernon. But he had finally gone too far. Hagrid seized his umbrella and whirled it over his head. "Never," he thundered, "insult Albus Dumbledore in front of me." He brought the umbrella swishing down through the air to point at Dudley. There was a flash of violet light, a sound like a firecracker, a sharp squeal, and the next second Dudley was dancing around on the spot with his hands clasped over his fat bottom, howling in pain. When he turned his back on them, Violet saw a curly pig's tail poking out through a hole in his trousers. Uncle Vernon roared. Pulling Aunt Petunia and Dudley into the other room, he cast one last terrified look at Hagrid and slammed the door behind them. Hagrid looked down at his umbrella and stroked his beard. "Shouldn't I lost me temper," he said ruefully, "but it didn't work anyway. Meant to turn him into a pig, but I suppose he was so much like a pig anyway, there wasn't much left to do." He cast a sideways look at the twins under his bushy eyebrows. "Be grateful if ye didn't mention that to anyone at Hogwarts," he said. "I'm not supposed to do magic, strictly speaking. I was allowed to do a bit to follow ye and get your letters to ye and stuff 1 the reasons I was so keen to take on the job." "Why aren't you supposed to do magic?" asked Harry, before Violet could stop him. It's not that she didn't want to know as well, but Violet had always had a better grasp of what sort of questions were considered rude to ask directly. Harry was still learning. "Oh, well," Hagrid said, clearly caught off guard. "I was at Hogwarts myself, but I got expelled, to tell ye the truth. In me 3rd year, they snapped me wand in half and everything, but Dumbledore let me stay on as gamekeeper. Great man, Dumbledore. Why were you ow?" Violet had nudged her brother hard in the ribs with her elbow. He scowled, but at least he shut up. They'd only just met Hagrid. The last thing she wanted was for him to hate them. Hagrid yawned loudly. "It's getting late, and we've got lots to do tomorrow," he said, stretching out his arms over his enormous head. They reached high enough for his knuckles to scrape the ceiling. "Gotta get up to town, get all your books and that." He took off his thick black coat and threw it to the twins. "You can kip under that," he said. "Darn, mind if it wriggles a bit. I think I still got a couple dormice in the pockets." Chapter 4, Diagon Alley. Violet hardly slept at all that night. She kept waking herself up to look at the couch and make sure that the big, hairy giant called Hagrid was still sleeping there. She had to be sure that it wasn't all a dream or a trick, or worse, some horrible prank by the Dursleys to crush their spirits even further. Magic children with famous parents, an evil wizard that couldn't kill them, a whole school full of witches and wizards. It all sounded too good to be true. And yet their Hagrid was every time Violet opened her eyes, his great chest rising and falling as he slept. Beside her, buried under Hagrid's massive black coat, Harry was fast asleep, his eyes moving frantically behind his lids. Dreams, and perhaps the same fears as his sister. When Violet finally opened her eyes for good, gritty with sleep and sore from laying on the hard stone floor all night, it was to the sight of sunlight shining through the windows of the hut and filling the room with light. The storm was over. Hagrid remained on the collapsed sofa, and mostly oddly of all, there was an owl rapping its claw on the window, with a newspaper held in its beak. Violet scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping over Harry as she did. She went straight to the window and jerked it open. The owl swooped in and dropped the newspaper on top of Hagrid, who didn't wake up. The owl then fluttered onto the floor and began to attack Hagrid's coat. "Roman 6, stop," said Harry's muffled voice from beneath the heavy black fabric. "It's not me," she hissed, trying to wave the owl off of him, but it snapped its beak fiercely at her and carried on savaging the coat. "What? Then who?" Harry's head popped out from beneath the coat. He squinted, as he wasn't wearing his glasses, at the fluffy little brown shape on top of him and let out a sharp yelp. "Get it off me." "I'm trying. Hagrid," said Violet loudly. "Please wake up. There's an owl. Pay him." Hagrid grunted into the sofa. "What? He wants payin' for deliverin' the paper. Look in the pockets." Harry scrambled out from beneath the coat and helped her search. Hagrid's coat seemed to be made of nothing but pockets, bunches of keys, slug pellets, balls of string, peppermint humbugs, tea bags. Finally, Harry pulled out a handful of strange-looking coins. "Give him 5 nuts," said Hagrid sleepily. "Which ones are those?" Violet asked. "The little bronze ones." Harry counted out 5 little bronze coins, and the owl held out its leg so that he could put the money into a small leather pouch tied to it. Then it flew off through the open window. Hagrid yawned loudly, sat up, and stretched. "Best be off, you two. Lots to do today. Gotta get up to London and buy all your stuff for school." Violet, who had just recently been to London with Aunt Petunia, couldn't imagine where in the city they could possibly find any equipment for wizard school. She had seen plenty of accountants' offices, law offices, travel agencies, specialty repair shops, and even a bakery, but nowhere that looked like it was remotely capable of selling magical things. Then again, if there were such a place, it would be just like Aunt Petunia to avoid walking past it. Harry, however, voiced another valid concern, one that hadn't even occurred to her. Hagrid," he said, still turning over the funny little coins in his hand. Said Hagrid, who was pulling on his huge boots. "We haven't got any money, and you heard Uncle Vernon last night. He won't pay for us to go and learn magic." Violet's heart sank into her stomach. Of course they'd need money, of which they had absolutely none. The Dursleys had never given them an allowance, and any money they had managed to scrounge up from between couch cushions or off the pavement while out for walk was always found and claimed by Uncle Vernon during the monthly raids on their cupboard, in search of anything they might have stolen or be trying to hide. Violet had once saved up a whole £7 in change and kept it secret for 3 months until their uncle had found it and taken it away. Now she had nothing. She couldn't go to wizard school after all. "Don't worry about that," Hagrid said, snapping her out of her miserable thoughts as he stood up to scratch his head. "Do ye think your parents didn't leave ye anything? But if their house was destroyed, they didn't keep their money in the house, boy. Nah, first stop for us is Gringotts. Wizard's Bank. Have a sausage. They're not bad cold, and I wouldn't say no tay a bit o' your birthday cake neither. Wizard's Havebanks. Just the one. Gringotts. Run by goblins." Harry dropped the bit of sausage he was holding, and Violet's mind made a noise like a record scratch. "Goblins. Yeah, so ye'd be mad to try and rob it, I'll tell ye that. Never mess with goblins, Harry. Gringotts is the safest place in the world for anything ye want to keep safe, 'cept maybe Hogwarts. As a matter of fact, I gotta visit Gringotts anyway for Dumbledore." "Hogwarts business." Hagrid drew himself up proudly. "He usually gets me to do important stuff for him. Fetchin' you gettin' things from Gringotts knows he can trust me, see? Got everything. Come on, then." The twins followed Hagrid out onto the rock. The sky was quite clear now, and the sea gleamed in the sunlight. The boat Uncle Vernon had hired was still there, with a lot of water in the bottom after the storm. "How did you get here?" Harry asked, looking around for another boat. "Flew," said Hagrid. "Flew," the twins said in unison. "Yeah, but we'll go back in this. Not esposed to use magic now I've got ye." They settled down in the boat, Violet and Harry still staring at Hagrid, trying to imagine him flying. "Seems a shame to row, though," said Hagrid, giving them another of his sideways looks. "If I was to speed things up a bit, would ye mind not mentioning it at Hogwarts?" "Of course not." Harry said, and looked to Violet, who nodded adamantly. They were both eager to see more magic. Hagrid pulled out the pink umbrella again, tapped it twice on the side of the boat, and they sped off toward land. "Why would you be mad to try and rob Gringotts?" Harry asked. "Spells, enchantments," said Hagrid, unfolding his newspaper as he spoke. "They said there's Dragon's Garden, the high-security vaults, and then ye gotta find your way. Gringotts is hundreds of miles under London, see, deep under the underground. Ye'd die of hunger tryin' ter get out, even if ye did manage ter get your hands on summat." The twins sat and thought about this while Hagrid read his newspaper, Thedley Prophet. They had learned from Uncle Vernon that people liked to be alone while they did this, but it was very difficult for them, as they'd never had so many questions in their lives. "Ministry are magic messin' things up as usual," Hagrid muttered, turning the page. "There's a Ministry of Magic?" Violet asked before she could stop herself. "Course," said Hagrid. "They wanted Dumbledore fur minister, o' course, but he'd never leave Hogwarts, so old Cornelius Fudge got the job. Bungler if every there was one. So he pelts Dumbledore with owls every morning, asking fur advice. But what does a Ministry of Magic do? Well, their main just is to keep it from the muggles that there's still witches and wizards up and down the country." "Why?" Harry asked. "Why?" "Blimey, Harry, everyone be wanting magic solutions to their problems. Nah, we're best left alone." At this moment, the boat bumped gently into the harbour wall. Hagrid folded up his newspaper, and they clambered up the stone steps onto the street. Passers-by stared a lot at Hagrid as they walked through the little town to the station. Violet couldn't blame them. Not only was Hagrid twice as tall as anyone else, he kept pointing at perfectly ordinary things like parking meters and saying loudly, "See that? Things these muggles dream up, eh?" "Hagrid," said Harry, a question in his voice, even as the two of them panted to keep up with Hagrid's massive stride. "Did you say they're Aradragons at Gringotts?" "Well, so they say," said Hagrid. "Crikey, I'd like a dragon." "You'd like one?" Violet asked, astonished. All the tales she'd ever heard about dragons painted them as great, vicious monsters who cared for nothing but their treasure hoards and would burn whole villages just to feed themselves. Hagrid was a large man, but surely not large enough to keep a dragon for a pet. "Wanted one ever since I was a kid," he went on, holding the door open for them as they passed into the station. "Here we go now." There was a train to London in 5 minutes' time. Hagrid, who didn't understand muggle money, as he called it, gave the bills to Violet so she could buy their tickets. People stared more than ever on the train. Hagrid took up 2 seats and sat knitting what looked like a canary-yellow circus tent. "Still got your letters, kids?" he asked as he counted the stitches. Harry took both parchment envelopes out of his pocket, his and Violet's, whose skirt had no pockets at all, and passed her the one with her name on it. "Good," said Hagrid. "There's a list there of everything ye need." Hagrid winked. "If ye know where to go." Violet had only been to London a handful of times with Aunt Petunia, but she had never realized until now just how large the city really was. She'd only got to see a tiny portion of it as she was dragged from shop to shop, and Harry had never even been to the city at all. Although Hagrid seemed to know where he was going, he was obviously not used to getting there in an ordinary way. He got stuck in the ticket barrier on the underground and complained loudly that the seats were too small and the trains too slow. "I don't know how muggles manage without magic," he said as they climbed a broken-down escalator that led up to a bustling road lined with shops. Hagrid was so huge that he parted the crowds easily. All Harry and Violet had to do was hold hands and keep close behind him. They passed bookshops and music stores, hamburger restaurants and cinemas, but nowhere that looked as if it could sell you a magic wand. This was just an ordinary street, full of ordinary people. Could there really be piles of wizard gold buried miles beneath them? Were there really shops that sold spellbooks and broomsticks? And if so, how did they keep muggles from just wandering and poking around? Violet got something of an answer moments later as Hagrid drew to a halt. "This is it," he said. The Leaky Cauldron. It's a famous place. It was a tiny, grubby-looking pub. If Hagrid hadn't pointed it out, Violet wouldn't have noticed it was there. The people hurrying by didn't glance at it. Their eyes slid from the big bookshop on one side to the record shop on the other, as if they couldn't see the Leaky Cauldron at all. In fact, Violet suspected that only the three of them could see it after all. Before she could ask if she was right or not, Hagrid had steered them inside. For a famous place, it was very dark and shabby. A few old women were sitting in a corner, drinking tiny glasses of sherry. One of them was smoking a long pipe. A little man in a top hat was talking to the old bartender, who was quite bald and looked like a toothless walnut. The low buzz of chatter stopped when they walked in. Everyone seemed to know Hagrid. They waved and smiled at him, and the bartender reached for a glass, saying, "The usual, Hagrid." "Can't, Tom. I'm on Hogwarts business," said Hagrid, clapping his great hands on Harry and Violet's shoulders and making their knees buckle. "Good Lord," said the bartender, peering at the twins. Can this be?" The Leaky Cauldron had suddenly gone completely still and silent. "Bless my soul," whispered the old bartender, "the Potters." "What an honor." He hurried out from behind the bar, rushed toward the twins and seized each of their hands in turn, tears in his eyes. "Welcome back, children, welcome back." Violet didn't know what to say. Everyone was looking at them. The old woman with the pipe was puffing on it without realizing it had gone out. Hagrid was beaming. Then there was a great scraping of chairs, and the next moment, the twins found themselves shaking hands with everyone in the Leaky Cauldron. "Doris Crockford, Mr. Potter, can't believe I'm meeting you at last. So proud, Miss Potter, I'm just so proud. Always wanted to shake your hand, I'm all of a flutter. Delighted, Miss Potter, just can't tell you, Diggle's the name, Dédalus Diggle." "I've seen you before," said Harry, as Dédalus Diggle made to shake his hand as well. "You bowed to us once in a shop." "They remember," cried Mr. Diggle, looking around at everyone. "Did you hear that? He remembers me." The twins shook hands again, and again Doris Crockford kept coming back for more. A pale young man made his way forward very nervously. One of his eyes was twitching. Violet was incredibly grateful that he did not reach out for her. "Professor Quirrell," said Hagrid. "Children, Professor Quirrell will be one of your teachers at Hogwarts." "P.P. Potter," stammered Professor Quirrell, nodding jerkily to each one of them in turn. "Can't tell you how pleased I am to meet you both." "What sort of magic do you teach, Professor Quirrell?" Harry asked. "Defense against the dark arts," muttered Professor Quirrell, as though he'd rather not think about it. "And not that you need it, children?" He laughed nervously. "You'll be getting all your equipment, I suppose." "I've got to pick up a new book on vampires, and myself." He looked terrified at the very thought. But the others wouldn't let Professor Quirrell keep the twins to himself. It took almost 10 minutes to get away from them all, no thanks to Harry and his questions. Though he seemed just as bewildered as Violet at all the attention, her brother was undoubtedly handling it with more enthusiasm. Harry thrived on attention, good or bad. Violet shrank from it. She very badly wished to shrink away from this entire scene and all of the people looking at her, staring and touching. At last, Hagrid managed to make himself heard over the babble. "Must get on lots turby." "Come on, Harry, Violet." Doris Crockford shook each of their hands one last time, and Hagrid led them through the bard and out into a small, walled courtyard where there was nothing but a trash bin and a few weeds. Hagrid grinned at them. "Told ye, didn't I? Told ye you were famous." Even Professor Quirrell was trembling to meet ye, mind you, he's usually trembling. "Is he always that nervous?" "Oh, yeah, poor bloke. Brilliant mind. He was fine while he was studying, out of books, but then he took a year off to get some first-hand experience. They say he met vampires in the Black Forest, and there was a nasty bit of trouble with a hag never been the same since. Scared of the students, scared of his own subject now, where's me umbrella? Vampires. Hags." Harry and Violet shared a look of mingled confusion and excitement. Hagrid, meanwhile, was counting brings in the wall above the trash bin. "3 up, 2 across," he muttered. "Right, stand back." He tapped the wall 3 times with the point of his umbrella. The brick he had touched quivered, it wriggled in the middle. A small hole appeared, it grew wider, and wider a second later. They were facing an archway large enough even for Hagrid. An archway onto a cobbled street that twisted and turned out of sight. "Welcome," said Hagrid, "to Diagon Alley." He grinned at the twins' amazement. They stepped through the archway. Violet looked quickly over her shoulder and saw the archway shrink instantly back into a solid wall. The sun shone brightly on a stack of cauldrons outside the nearest shop. Cauldrons all sizes, copper, brass, pewter, silver, self-stirring, collapsible, said a sign hanging over them. "Yeah, you'll be needing those," said Hagrid, "but we gotta get your money first." Violet wished she had about 8 more eyes. She and Harry turned their heads in every direction as they walked up the street, trying to look at everything at once. The shops, the things outside them, the people doing their shopping. A plump woman outside, an apothecary, was shaking her head as they passed, saying, "Dragon liver, 16 sickles an ounce, they're mad." A low, soft hooting came from a dark ship with a sign saying Eolip's Owl Emporium Tawny, Screech, Barn, Brown and Snowy. Several boys of about the twins' age had their noses pressed against a window with broomsticks in it. "Look," Violet heard one of them say. "The new Nimbus 2000 fastest ever." There were shops selling robes, shops selling telescopes and strange silver instruments Violet had never seen before. Windows stacked with barrels of bat spleens and eel's eyes, tottering piles of spell books, quills and rolls of parchment, potion bottles, globes of the moon. "Gringotts," said Hagrid. They had reached a snowy white building that towered over the other little shops. Standing beside its burnished bronze doors, wearing a uniform of scarlet and gold, was that's a goblin, said Hagrid quietly as they walked up the white stone steps toward him. The goblin was about a head shorter than Violet and Harry. He had a swarthy, clever face, a pointed beard, and Violet noticed very long fingers and feet. He bowed as they walked inside. Now they were facing a second pair of doors, silver this time, with words engraved upon them. "Enter, stranger, but take heed of what awaits the sin of greed. For those who take, but do not earn, must pay most dearly in their turn. So if you seek beneath our floors a treasure that was never yours, thief, you have been warning, beware of finding more than treasure there. Like I said, ye'd be mad to try and rob it," said Hagrid. A pair of goblins bowed them through the silver doors, and they were in a vast marble hall. About 100 more goblins were sitting on high stools behind a long counter, scribbling in large ledgers, weighing coins in brass scales, examining precious stones through eyeglasses. There were too many doors to count leading off the hall, and yet more goblins were showing people in and out of these. Hagrid and the twins made for the counter. "Morning," said Hagrid to a free goblin. "We've come to take some money out of Mr. and Miss Potter's safe." "You have their key, sir." "Got it here somewhere," said Hagrid, and he started emptying his pockets onto the counter, scattering a handful of mouldy dog biscuits over the goblin's book of numbers. The goblin wrinkled his nose. Violet watched the goblin on their right weigh a pile of rubies as big as glowing coals. "Got it," said Hagrid at this, holding up a tiny golden key. The goblin looked at it closely. "That seems to be in order. And I've also got a letter here from Professor Dumbledore," said Hagrid importantly, throwing out his chest. "It's about the you-know-what in Vault 713. The goblin read the letter very carefully. "Very well," he said, handing it back to Hagrid. "I will have someone take you down to both vaults. Griffook." Griffook was yet another goblin. Once Hagrid had crammed all the dog biscuits back inside his pockets, he and the twins followed Griffook toward one of the doors leading off of the hall. "What's the you-know-what in Vault 713? Harry asked, despite the fact that it was clearly a secret and they weren't meant to know about it. "Can't tell ye that," said Hagrid reasonably. "Very secret, Hogwarts business. Dumbledore's trusted me. More'n my job's worth to tell ye that." Griffook held the door open for them. Violet, who had expected more marble, was surprised. They were in a narrow stone passageway lit with flaming torches. It sloped steeply downward, and there were little railway tracks on the floor. Griffock whistles and a small cart came hurtling up the track toward them. They climbed in Hagrid with some difficulty and were off. At first, they just hurtled through a maze of twisting passages. Violet tried to remember left, right, right, middle fork, right, left, but it was impossible. The rattling car seemed to know its own way, because Griffock wasn't steering. Violet clung to Harry's arm, eyes stinging as the cold air rushed past them, but unable to close them and look away. Once, Harry twisted around in his seat as though he'd seen something, but she'd thought he was falling out of the cart and only clung to him all the tighter. Down, down they plunged, every deeper, passing an underground lake where huge stalagmites and stalactites grew from the ceiling and the floor. When they finally came to stop beside a small door in the passage wall, Hagrid got out and had to learn against the wall to stop his knees from trembling. Violet reached up and patted his elbow, which earned her a wobbly smile. Griffock unlocked the door. A lot of green smoke came billowing out, and as it cleared, Violet and Harry gasped. Inside were mounds of gold coins, columns of silver, heaps of little bronze nuts. They covered the floor, piled nearly to the ceiling in some places, and all gleaming and spotless, as if they'd only been minted the day before. "All yours," smiled Hagrid. "All theirs." It was incredible. The Dursleys couldn't have known about this, or they'd have had it from the twins faster than blinking. How often had they complained about how much Harry and Violet cost them to keep, and all the time there had been a fortune belonging to them, buried deep under London. Hagrid helped them pile some of it into 2 small bags. Even though he was grabbing handfuls, it didn't make some so much as a dent. "The gold ones are galleons," he explained. 17 silver sickles to a galleon and 29 nuts to a sickle. It's easy enough. It absolutely was noticey enough. That was the most ridiculous system Violet ever heard of, yet she didn't feel qualified enough to argue the subject, certainly not with a Goblin Bank clerk standing right there. She hefted her bag of gold in both hands and frowned at it. Hagrid turned to Griffock. "Vault 713 now, please, and can we go more slowly?" "1 speed only," said Griffock. They were going even deeper now and gathering speed. The air became colder and colder as they hurtled around tight corners. They went rattling over an underground ravine, and Harry leaned over the side to try and see what was down at the dark bottom, but Violet squealed and pulled him back by the scruff of his shirt. Vault 713 had no keyhole. "Stand back," said Griffock, important. He stroked the door gently with one of his long fingers, and it simply melted away. If anyone but a Gringotts goblin tried that, they'd be sucked through the door and trapped in there, said Griffock. "How often do you check to see if anyone's inside?" Violet asked. "About once every 10 years, said Griffock with a rather nasty grin. Something really extraordinary had to be inside this top security vault, Violet was sure, and she and Harry leaned forward eagerly, expecting to see fabulous jewels at the very least, but at first they thought it was empty. Then they noticed a grubby little package wrapped up in brown paper lying on the floor. Hagrid picked it up and tucked it deep inside his coat. Violet longed to know what it was, and for once wished Harry had been foolish enough to ask. "Come on, back in this infernal cart, and darn talk to me on the way back. It's best if I keep me mouth shut," said Hagrid. One wild cart ride later they stood blinking in the sunlight outside Gringotts. Violet didn't know where to run first now that she had a bag full of money. She didn't have to know how many galleons there were to a pound to know that she was holding more money than she'd ever had in her whole life, more money that even Dudley had ever had. "Might as well get your uniforms," said Hagrid, nodding toward Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions. "Listen, you two, would ye mind if I slipped off for a pick-me-up in the leaky cauldron? I hate them Gringotts carts." "Is that allowed?" asked Violet nervously. "We can just go off on our own." Well, what was visible of Hagrid's face beneath the beard flushed a bright red, and he avoided her eyes. "Strictly speaking, I darn reckon I'm supposed to let ye out o' me sight." His expression turned almost pleading. But it's only for a minute or so, and so long as ye both promise not to wander, just go right into the shop and straight back out, nowhere else, and I'll be waitin' for ye outside. Promise, cross me heart." Violet bit her lip. Hagrid was looking a bit sick still, but she didn't like the thought of being away from him. She'd felt safe by his side ever since they'd met, and that wasn't a feeling that came naturally, even with Harry beside her. And it was Harry who, still beside her now, grabbed her hand and gave her courage to nod and see Hagrid off on his way. The twins entered the shop alone, but hand in hand. Madame Malkin was a squat, smiling witch all dressed in mauve. "Hogwarts, dears," she said, when they started to speak. "Got the lot here, another young man being fitted up just now, in fact. Whichever of you wants to go first, come along." Harry looked to Violet with a question, the answer to which she gave by shaking her head and letting go of his hand. While he followed Madame Malkin into the back of the shop, Violet settled herself on a wide velvet sofa and tried not to let her nerves get the best of her. She could hear voices as she sat there, her brother's as well as another boy's, though far too muffled to understand what was being said, and allowed to really think about how surreal and unbelievable the last 12 hours of her life had been. A giant had flew in during a storm to deliver some letters, and tried to turn Dudley into a pig but failed. A pub full of strangers crowded to shake her hand as though she were a celebrity. A brick wall melted and shrank right before her eyes, leading to a secret part of London that she had never dreamed could exist. Goblins were looking after the fortune her parents had left her in real gold coins. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. It was absolutely ridiculous, and yet here she was with a heavy pouch of money in her lap and no idea what could possibly happen next that day. She was going to wizard school. Wizard school, which was for wizards and witches, which she apparently was. It was wasbonkers, as her old social studies teacher used to say. Utterly bonkers, but at the same time, how wonderful. Violet was startled out of her thoughts by a loud exclamation from the back room and a loud tapping on the window from outside. She whipped around to see Hagrid standing there, as promised, grinning at her and holding 3 large ice cream cones in a single hand. He pointed at them and then to the door of the shop and shook his head. Violet smiled at him in understanding. Perhaps he hadn't left them to go the pub after all. No one had ever bought her ice cream before just because they wanted to. It was sweet and made her heart swell up in her chest. It deflated slightly, however, when Harry returned from the back room of the shop. Gone was his confident air and reassuring smile. He was holding a large paper bag, which presumably contained his new robes, and leaned in close to Violet as she stood up to take her turn getting fitted. "Don't say anything to the boy back there," he muttered into her ear. "Don't even listen to him. It was like talking to Dudley." Violet immediately deflated. One did not so much talk to Dudley as Dudley would talk at them. She put on a brave face, feeling nervous again, though trying not to show it, as she stepped cautiously into the back of the shop. A boy with a pale, pointed face was standing on a footstool while a second witch pinned up his long black robes. Madame Malkin smiled at Violet and had her stand on a stool next to him and quickly slipped a long black robe over Violet's head. When her head was no longer covered, she realized that the boy was staring at her. "Hello," she said against her better judgment. "There was a boy in here a moment ago who looked just like you," he said, quite rudely. "Do you know him?" "We're twins," Violet answered. "Oh, I just supposed you all looked alike." Violet's face began to burn. She turned away from the boy and stared at a spot on the wall. The boy either did not get the hint that she was done speaking with him or simply didn't care. Violet would bet all her newfound fortune on the latter. She knew now why Harry thought the boy was like Dudley. "Your brother said you're with that beastly man out there. Is that true? Is he another relative of yours?" When Violet remained silent, he pressed on. "You are from a wizarding family, aren't you, even if your parents are dead?" Harry had only been back here with the boy for 5 minutes, Violet thought angrily. How could he have possibly blabbed out so much about them? "Are you listening to me?" the boy beside her said loudly, and with an inflection to his voice that was all too familiar to Violet. Are you deaf or just playing at being stupid? Leave me alone, Violet said sharply. She turned to look at the boy and was pleased by the shock on his face. It was likely no one had ever spoken to him like that before, and Violet felt proud to be the first. But the shock quickly melted into anger, and her pride went right back to its natural state of unease. I was only trying to be friendly, the boy said, as though she were the one to insult them. That's not how you make friends, she told him. She returned her gaze to the spot on the wall. If you'd ever had a friend before, you'd know that already. The boy opened his mouth to retort, but before he got the chance, Madame Malkin said, All right, and that's you done as well, dear, and Violet, wanting to leave before her nerves came back in full force, stepped down from the footstool and strode away quick as she could. Harry and Hagrid were waiting outside the shop for her. They had both already started on their ice cream, and hers were beginning to go a bit melted, but it was a great comfort after the unpleasantness in the shop. Harry seemed to be in better spirits as well. He and Hagrid were discussing some sort of sport when she arrived. And what are Slytherin and Hufflepuff? Harry asked, and Violet nearly dropped her ice cream. Are you all right? You sounded a bit funny just then. It's what that boy said they were called, Harry said, his ears reddening. He looked up at Hagrid. I did say it right, didn't I? Yeah, you did, don't you worry. Schoolhouses they are. There's 4. Everyone said Hufflepuff are a lot o' duffers, but I bet I'm in Hufflepuff, said Harry gloomily. Violet nudged him with her shoulder and smiled. Then at least we'll be duffers together, yeah. Better Hufflepuff than Slytherin, Hagrid said darkly. There's not a single witch or wizard who went back who wasn't in Slytherin. You know who was one. Sorry, you know who was at Hogwarts? Asked Harry. Years and years ago, said Hagrid. What about the others? Violet asked, catching a particularly big drip before it got to her hand. Hagrid looked at her blankly. The other houses, I mean. You said there were 4 of them. Oh, that they're in. Gryffindor and Ravenclaw are the last 2, and they've got some fine witches and wizards coming out of them. Your parents were Gryffindors, the both of them. But what are houses, Hagrid? Violet asked earnestly. What do they mean? Hagrid simply chuckled and patted her on the head hard enough to rattle her teeth. I think I best leave that for ye to see on your own, Violet. They bought the twins' school books in a shop called Flourish and Blatz, where the shelves were stalled to the ceiling with books as large as paving stones bound in leather. Books the size of postage stamps in covers of silk. Books full of peculiar symbols, and a few books with nothing in them at all. Even Dudley, who never read anything, would have been wild to get his hands on some of these. Violet reluctantly put back a beautifully illustrated book of fanciful creatures, but Hagrid had to almost drag Harry away from curses and counter-curses, bewitch your friends, and befuddle your enemies with the latest revenges. Hair loss, jelly legs, tongue-tying, and much, much more, by Professor Vindictus Viridian. I was trying to find out how to curse Dudley. I'm not saying that's not a good idea, but you're not to use magic in the Muggle world except in very special circumstances, said Hagrid. And anyway, you couldn't work any of them curses yet. Ye'll need a lot more study before ye get to that level. Hagrid also stopped Harry from buying a solid gold cauldron. It says pewter on your list. But the twins each got a nice set of scales for weighing potion ingredients and pair of collapsible brass telescopes. Then they visited the apothecary, which was fascinating enough to make up for its horrible smell, a mixture of bad eggs and rotted cabbages. Barrels of slimy stuff stood on the floor. Jars of herbs, dried roots, and bright powders lined the walls. Bundles of feathers, strings of fangs, and snarled claws hung from the ceiling. While Hagrid asked the man behind the counter for a supply of basic potion ingredients for them, Harry and Violet examined silver unicorn horns at 21 galleons each and minuscule, glittery black beetle eyes, 5 nuts a scoop. Outside the apothecary, Hagrid checked their list again. Just your wands left, oh yeah, and I still haven't got ye your birthday presents. Violet felt herself go red. But the ice cream was a treat, not a proper present. Tell ye what, I'll get ye your animals. Not toads. Toads went out of fashion years ago. Ye'd be laughed at and I darn like cats. They make me sneeze. I'll get you each an owl. All the kids want owls. They're dead useful, carry mail and everything. Harry began to follow Hagrid toward the owl shop with a bounce in his step, but Violet felt herself hanging back. Fortunately, her brother noticed and stopped. "What's wrong, Roman 6? I don't know if I want an owl," Violet said, hoping that Hagrid wouldn't hear her. But he had also noticed the two of them holding back and had come over to find out the problem. "That's all rig," Hagrid said quickly. "I didn't mean ye had to get one, only that it'd be nice ter well. What sort of pet would ye like ter have?" Violet bit her lip for what felt like the 100th time that day. She felt on the verge of crying. Hagrid had been too kind and only wanted to keep being kinder. He'd offered to buy her a pet, and she didn't want to make him feel as though it wasn't good enough, or that she was ungrateful for the offer, yet the thought of carrying an owl around and keeping it in her room held no appeal to her whatsoever. It wasn't polite of her, but Violet. Harry's voice cut through her panic, and Violet realized that she'd been crying after all. She quickly wiped her face with the back of her hand. Her brother was looking at her steadily, as he always did when she got like this. A calming, stable focus when everything felt like it was falling to pieces. Harry made her feel like everything was okay. "I'd like a cat," said Violet wetly, looking up at Hagrid and finding him with watery eyes as well. "I've always wanted one since we found those kitten under the porch, and Aunt Petunia made us give them away. They're so soft and lovely, and I'm scared of big birds like the ones we saw outside. And toads are slimy, and I don't want to be laughed at, so I think I'd really like a cat. Please." Hagrid let out a great sob. "Well, o' course they can have a cat. You can have any cat you like, any at all. Yell you what, why don't ye go on in and pick one out for yourself? Look at me, already blubbering, and not wanting to add sneezing on top of it. A great ruddy mess I make. I tell ye, well, go on now. We'll all meet right back here, just like before." 20 minutes later, Violet met back up with Harry and Hagrid and introduced one another to their new pets. Harry now carried a large cage that held a beautiful snowy owl, fast asleep with her head under her wing, and while Violet had both arms wrapped around very large, very orange cat with a bottle-brush tail and a slightly squished face. They both stammered their thanks to Hagrid, sounding like a chorus of Professor Quirrells. "Darn mention it," said Hagrid gruffly. "Darn expect you've have a lot of presents from the Dursleys." "Just Ollivanders left now, only place fur wands, Ollivanders, and ye gotta have the best wands." A magic wand. The twins shared looks of excitement. This was what they had really been looking forward to. The last shop was narrow and shabby. Peeling gold letters over the door read Ollivanders, makers of fine wands since 382B. See, a single wand lay on a faded purple cushion in the dusty window. A tinkling bell rang somewhere in the depths of the shop as they stepped inside it. It was a tiny place, empty except for a single, spindly chair that Hagrid sat on to wait. Violet felt strangely as though they had entered a very strict library. She reached out for Harry's sleeve as she looked around at the thousands and thousands of narrow boxes piled nearly up to the ceiling. For some reason, the back of her neck prickled. The very dust and silence in her seemed to tingle with some secret magic. "Good afternoon," said a soft voice. Violet jumped. Hagrid must have jumped too, because there was a loud crunching noise, and he got quickly off the spindly chair. An old man was staring before them, his wide, pale eyes shining like moons through the gloom of the shop. "Hello," said Harry awkwardly. Violet shrank further behind him. "Ah, yes," said the man. "Yes, yes. I thought I'd been seeing you soon." Harry Potter. His gaze flicked to Violet, peering over her brother's shoulder, and Violet Potter, too, my, what a pair you make. I must say you do favor your father's features. A fine wand that, mahogany, 11 inches, pliable, quite powerful and excellent for transfiguration. Though to look at you both now, I see it. Mr. Ollivander moved closer to them. Violet wished his wouldn't. You have your mother's eyes. It seemed only yesterday she was in here herself, buying her first wand. Another fine wand she favoured, 10¼ inches long, swishy, made of willow. Nice for charm work. Well, I say your mother favoured, and it's really the wand that chooses the wizard, of course. Mr. Ollivander had come so close to them now that Violet could perfectly see herself reflected in those misty eyes. He reached out slowly, but not for her. And that's where, Mr. Ollivander touched the lighting scar on Harry's forehead with a long, white finger. I'm sorry to say I sold the wand that did it, he said softly. 13½ inches. You, powerful wand, very powerful and in the wrong hands. Well, if I'd knows what that wand was going out into the world to do. He shook his head, and then, to the twins' relief, spotted Hagrid. Rubeus, Rubeus Hagrid, how nice to see you again. Oak, 16 inches, rather bendy, wasn't it? It was, sir, yes, said Hagrid. Good wand, that one. But I suppose they snapped it in half when you got expelled, said Mr. Ollivander, suddenly stern. Yes, they did, yes, said Hagrid, shuffling his feet. I've still got the pieces, though, he added brightly. But you darned to set them, said Mr. Ollivander sharply. Oh, no, sir, said Hagrid quickly. Violet noticed he gripped his pink umbrella very tightly as he spake. Said Mr. Ollivander, giving Hagrid a piercing look. Well now, Miss Potter, let me see. Violet snapped to attention at the use of her name, Mr. Ollivander had withdrawn a long tape measure with silver markings out of his pocket and was moving around toward her. Which is your wand arm? Well, I am left-handed, said Violet. Are you? Wonderful. Hold out your arm, if you please. That's it. He measured Violet from shoulder to finger, then wrist to elbow, shoulder to foot, knee to armpit, and round her head. As he measured, he said, Every Ollivander wand has a core of a powerful magical substance, Miss Potter. We use unicorn hairs, phoenix tail feathers, and the heartstrings of dragons. No two Ollivander wands are the same, just as no two unicorns, dragons, or phoenixes are quite the same. And of course, you will never get such good results with another wizard's wand. Violet suddenly realized that the tape measure, which was measuring between her nostrils, was doing this on its own. Mr. Ollivander was flitting around the shelves, taking down boxes. That will do, he said, and the tape measure crumpled to a heap on the floor. Right then, Miss Potter, try this one. Rowan and Phoenix feather, 10 inches, a bit whippy. Just take it and give it a wave. Violet took the wand and, feeling foolish, waved it around a bit, but Mr. Ollivander snatched it out of her hand almost at once. Walnut and dragon heartstring, 7 inches, somewhat springy. Violet tried, but she had hardly raised the wand when it, too, was snatched back by Mr. Ollivander. No, no, here, alder and unicorn hair, 12¾ inches. Nice and sturdy. Go on, try it out. Violet took the wand and held it. Mr. Ollivander did not immediately take it away again, which seemed promising, so she tried giving the wand a little circular wave. Immediately, she felt a wave of warmth through her fingers, and from the end spouted a little shower of silver and gold sparks that shimmered all the way down the floor before vanishing without a trace. Hagrid cheered, and Mr. Ollivander clapped his hands together in delight. Ah, yes, wonderful, wonderful. I had expected something of a trial, but it is so lovely to find one's match right away, is it not? And what a magnificent wand it is, too. I sense you shall find it most helpful to you, MS. Potter, and you will be quite good for it in turn. Violet didn't know what any of that meant. She didn't really know what all had just happened, though there was a feeling now, as she still held the wand in her hand, a familiarity of sorts that made her feel quite comfortable. The wand itself was a pale wood, polished to a shine, with a distinct grey stripe running through the grain all the way from handle to tip, and somehow it washes. The wand was placed back in its box for safekeeping, and Violet joined Hagrid in standing off to the side and watching while Mr. Ollivander set about measuring and questioning Harry. If Mr. Ollivander had expected a trial in finding the right wand, he certainly found it in Harry. The first wand was quickly snatched away, and so was the next, and the next after that, and even after that one as well. The first one that Harry actually got to hold long enough to give a proper wave shot out not sparks, but a bolt of force that rich-hutted around the shop and pinged loudly off of his new owl's cage. Mr. Ollivander took that wand away much more gently than the others and went off to pull down some more boxes. The pile of tried wands had mounted to quite an impressive height, but Mr. Ollivander only seemed to get happier and more excited as the process went on. Tricky customer, eh? Not to worry, we'll find the perfect match here somewhere, I wonder. Now yes, why not unusual combination holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, nice and supple. Harry took the wand in his right hand, where it was allowed to stay, and Violet watched a small smile appear on her brother's face. He raised the wand above his head, brought it swishing down through the air, and yelped in surprised delight as a stream of red and gold sparks shot from the end like a firework. Violet whooped and clapped, and Mr. Ollivander cried, "Oh, bravo! Yes, indeed, oh, very good. Well, well, well. How curious, how very curious." He put Harry's wand back into its box and wrapped it in brown paper, still muttering, "Curious, curious." "Sorry," said Harry, "but what's curious?" Mr. Ollivander fixed Harry with his pale stare. "I remember every wand I've ever sold, Mr. Potter. Every single wand. It so happens that the phoenix whose tail feather is in your wand gave another feather just one other. It is very curious indeed that you should be destined for this wand when its brother gave you that scar." Violet felt a sudden coldness drop like a stone into her stomach. "Yes, 13.5 inches. Curious indeed how these things happen. The wand chooses the wizard, remember. I think we must expect great things from you, Mr. Potter. After all, he who must not be named did great things, terrible, yes, but great." Harry shivered visibly. He was silent as they paid for each of their wands 7 galleons each, and Mr. Ollivander bowed them from his shop. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky as Hagrid and the twins made their way back down Diagon Alley, back through the wall, back through the leaky cauldron, now empty. Harry didn't speak at all as they walked down the road, which was so unlike him that Violet kept giving him glances out of the corner of her eye. He was so lost in thought that he didn't seem to notice all the stares and gawking from the people on the underground, laden as they were with all their funny-shaped packages and animals. Up another escalator, out into Paddington Station. Harry only seemed to realize where they were when Violet tugged insistently at his sleeve. "Got time for a bite to eat before your train leaves," Hagrid said. He bought them each a hamburger, and they sat down on plastic seats to each them. Harry kept looking around. "What is it, Harry?" Violet finally asked, when she noticed Hagrid watching her brother as well. Harry chewed his hamburger with a soft frown, clearly thinking about what he wanted to say. "Everyone thinks we're special," he said at last. "All those people, the leaky cauldron, Professor Quirrell, Mr. Ollivander. But we don't know anything about magic at all. How can they expect great things? We're famous, and we can't even remember what we're famous for. We don't know what happened when the night our parents died. Just because we don't know anything yet doesn't mean we can't learn or won't be special," Violet said, picking a bit of tomato off her burger. "We're only just starting, Harry. It's not fair to sell yourself short." Hagrid leaned across the table with a chuckle. Behind the wild beard and eyebrows, he wore a very kind smile. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Violet, and your sister's right, Harry. You'll learn fast enough. Everyone starts at the beginnings at Hogwarts. You'll be just fine. Just be yourselves. I know it's hard. You've been singled out, and that's always hard. But you'll have a great time at Hogwarts. I did still do, smatter of fact." Hagrid helped Harry and Violet on to the train that would take them back to the Dursleys, then handed them each an envelope. "Your tickets for Hogwarts," he said. "First of September, King's Cross, it's all on your ticket. Any problems with the Dursleys, send me a letter with that owl of yours. She'll know where to find me. See ya soon, kids." The train pulled out of the station. Violet wanted to watch Hagrid until he was out of sight. She rose in her seat and pressed her nose against the window, Harry doing just the same right beside her. but she blinked, and Hagrid had gone.